Okay, so let's unpack this. We're diving deep today into something that, feels like it has its own kind of power.
Yeah, a force that doesn't just shift governments, right?
Yeah.
Or borders.
Exactly, not just borders, but it seems to like reshape the very soul of an era. We're talking revolutions, but
Yeah.
and maybe not just the political stuff you read about.
More like a faith,
Yeah,
a really fervent belief system.
precisely. It makes you think of that line, from Dostoevsky. The fire is in the minds of men and not in the roofs of buildings.
That's a powerful image, and it fits perfectly with what we're getting into.
Yeah, that's exactly the territory we're exploring.
What's really fascinating, I think, is moving beyond just seeing revolutions as, purely material things,
Right.
driven by economics or just power grabs.
Right.
The source material for this deep dive James H. Billington's massive work, Fire in the Minds of Men, it really pushes us to look at the belief system, the ideological furnace, you could say.
The engine behind it all.
Yeah, the thing that powered those early modern revolutions. We're tracing its origins, specifically back to the late 18th, early 19th centuries.
Okay. So our mission today, and we're sticking really close to Billington's work here, it's about figuring out where this specific modern kind of revolutionary belief actually came from.
Right, the genesis.
We're going to trace its roots,
Mm-hmm.
the ideas, yeah, but also the symbols, the key people, even the kind of strange places where it first popped up.
And Billington makes this really critical distinction, and we need to stick to it too.
Which is?
This isn't history from below. We're not focusing on, say, the struggles of peasants or workers, driven by hunger or something.
Okay, not the socioeconomic angle primarily.
No, explicitly, this is a study from above. It's looking at the spiritual thirst, the intense passions, the sometimes really eccentric ideas of the intellectual elites.
The thinkers.
The thinkers, exactly. The architects, maybe even the high priests of this new secular faith.
Got it. So the focus is on the originators of the ideas.
Absolutely. And as we dig in, you'll see the sources reveal this central tension right from the start, a dynamic struggle.
Within the revolution itself.
Within its core ideals, actually. Liberty, equality, fraternity, as they were radically reinterpreted and, chased after.
And that tension shaped things.
Massively. Not just the words they used, but the actual direction the movement took, the divisions that emerged early on.
And for you, listening, getting into this stuff, it's not just old history. It's a way to get maybe a deeper, more nuanced handle on forces that have seriously shaped the world we're in right now.
Yeah, understanding how radical ideas actually take root, sometimes in really unexpected places.
How they get loaded with this intense belief.
And spread. And become these drivers of huge world-changing events.
Okay, let's do it. Let's explore the foundations of this revolutionary faith.
So first things first, we need to get a handle on what Billington actually means by this revolutionary faith. He presents it as way more than just like a political plan. It is fundamentally a belief system. He argues that modern revolutionaries are really believers.
Believers, like religious believers.
Yeah, with an intensity, a level of commitment that he says is totally comparable to religious folks from earlier times who were devoted to God or spiritual goals.
So it wasn't just about policy debates or signing petitions. It was bigger than that for them, like a sacred project.
That's the idea, exactly. And the really new part, the core idea that hadn't really been seen before, it was this belief, this conviction that a perfect secular order, like a paradise right here on earth, could be created.
Okay, an earthly paradise.
But not through, God stepping in or slow reform. No, it would come from the forcible overthrow, often violent, of traditional authority.
Wow. So tear down the old world, violently if needed, to build a perfect new one.
Yes. Monarchs, aristocrats, the church, whatever stood in the way. This belief in achieving utopia through radical political action, this beginning without return, that would just dismantle everything old. Billington calls it an inherently improbable idea.
Yeah, improbable seems mild.
Right, but somehow this improbable idea became Europe's super dynamic ideological export. It went everywhere.
That is quite a leap of faith. Building heaven by burning down the house. And who are the ones making this leap? You said intellectual elite studied from above. What does that tell us?
It's crucial. Billington zeroes in on the typical 19th century European revolutionary. And he identifies them primarily as thinkers.
People driven by ideas.
Exactly. Individuals defined by ideas, by this spiritual or intellectual hunger for a totally transformed world, not primarily motivated by, say, material needs, like the working class might be.
So the study is deliberately looking at their minds, their passions.
Yeah, the psychological landscape, the convictions, the intellectual frameworks of the people who actually dreamed up and pushed this new faith. The goal isn't a big sociological study of why masses revolted.
Yep.
It's more about exploring the concrete tradition of revolutionaries, the lineage of the ideas and the people who carried them, rather than just analyzing the process of revolution abstractly.
Gotcha. So it's inductive, exploratory, tracing these specific currents.
Right. We're tracing the lineage of the match in that Dostoevsky quote, the ideas themselves, not just the dry tinder of social conditions.
We're looking at the minds where the fire was lit.
Exactly. And these minds, as Billington shows, were deeply wrapped up in and often kind of conflicted about those deceptively simple words that became the slogan: liberty, equality, fraternity.
The famous Trinity. But liberty, that wasn't entirely new, was it? Early revolutions fought for that.
No, you're right. Liberty was definitely the battle cry in places like the Netherlands, England, the American colonies, much earlier.
Uh-huh.
But those revolutions, they tended to create complex political structures. Think about the U.S. system separation of powers, checks, and balances.
Right. Ways to limit power.
Exactly. Mechanisms designed, fundamentally, to limit tyranny, to build, like, a secure fence around freedom.
Okay, so earlier liberty was about building fences, protecting freedom within an ordered system.
Pretty much. But the French Revolution, it brought something different into the mix. Two new ideals, fraternity and equality, emerged with this new force.
Yeah.
And a more collectivist flavor.
And they clashed with liberty sometimes.
Often came into direct rivalry, yeah. And the sources point out something really significant here.
What's that?
The key terms we still use today to talk about these collectivist ideas: nationalism, for that new all-in fraternity of the nation, and communism, for the radical push for equality, even getting rid of private property.
Yeah.
Both terms were first coined, started circulating, right there in the 1790s, forged in the same revolutionary fire.
Wait, nationalism and communism born in the same decade? Just putting those two together? That says a lot about the forces unleashed.
It really does. And this simultaneous birth created this fundamental ongoing struggle within the revolutionary tradition itself.
How so?
You had advocates of national revolution pushing for this new binding fraternity within the nation state, pitted against advocates of social revolution striving for a radical, often universal equality.
And that tension just kept playing out.
Became a core dynamic for centuries.
Yeah. So, given this specific mix of ideals, this particular blend, where did this strange new faith, this fire, actually find the best ground to take root? Where did it spread most easily?
Billington's analysis points to European societies that were missing a couple of key things that you did find in, say, Northern Europe or North America.
Okay, what were they missing?
First, they didn't really have a strong tradition of established ideological dissent, like a precedent for breaking with the big authorities, the way Protestantism broke with the medieval church.
Right. And second?
Second, they didn't have modified monarchical power, meaning there wasn't a strong tradition of organized political opposition or established parliaments or constitutions that could kind of absorb or channel dissent within the system.
So places where power was more absolute, less used to fundamental ideological challenge?
Exactly. So the revolutionary faith first really grabbed hold in places fighting authoritarian Catholicism, France, Italy, Poland. Then later, against religiously backed autocracies like Lutheran Prussia or Orthodox Russia.
Interesting contrast.
Yeah, and by contrast, Billington notes, it attracted almost no homegrown followers in Northern Europe and North America. Places with stronger Protestant traditions, individual conscience, and robust parliamentary systems that provided other channels for opposition and change.
That's a really crucial point. It suggests the fire didn't just ignite because of oppression alone,
Right.
but because of a specific type of social structure and the absence of other traditions that might handle dissent differently.
Yes, the rigidity of the old order, combined with this intellectual class searching for meaning and power outside those structures, that was the fuel. And the profile of these early professional social revolutionaries, from early guys like Marshall right up to Lenin, they were largely middle class. Overwhelmingly male intellectuals, often kind of detached from traditional family or community ties.
Detached. Interesting.
And Billington makes another interesting point. When women played a leading role, the movements tended to be more internationalist, more visionary. When workers got involved, they often became more parochial, more pragmatic, focused on immediate local stuff.
That's a fascinating nuance. So the detached, intellectual, often male revolutionary, maybe particularly drawn to the abstract, universal, radical visions this faith offered.
It seems that way, and that fire metaphor from Dostoevsky, it's really central to understanding this intellectual starting point.
Yeah.
Billington links it to actual historical fires, too.
Right.
The mysterious fires in St. Petersburg in 1861, right after the serfs were emancipated, seen as reflecting inflamed passions. And the devastating fires in Paris during the brutal end of the Paris Commune in 1871, which kind of shattered some romantic illusions, reduced grand dreams to ashes.
And that Dostoevsky quote, "With a match, one has no need of a lever. One does not lift up the world, one burns it." That speaks to the destructive potential in the ideology itself.
It captures that sense of radical, total transformation through destruction, yeah. And this connects directly to an early slogan that sums it up. From the spark comes the flame. Billington traces this back to Sylvain Maréchal, even before 1800, who predicted this truly egalitarian social revolution. And tellingly, that same slogan, later picked up by Lenin for his revolutionary journal, Iskra.
Iskra means the spark.
Exactly. A clear line, almost like an apostolic succession, from an early thinker of social revolution to the leader of the first successful one.
Beyond slogans, what myths, what models did they look to? For inspiration, maybe justification?
The sources point to a recurring one, speaks to the sheer ambition of it all, Prometheus.
Stealing fire from the gods.
Right, bringing light to humanity. This clicked with the broader Enlightenment belief in science and reason bringing progress. But for revolutionaries, it had this millenarian twist. This light would bring a completely new era. The darkness of the old order would just vanish.
The solar myth of the revolution.
That's what Billington calls it. An image of a new sun rising on a totally changed world. It wasn't just an image interpreting reality. It was meant to produce a new reality.
So drawing on ancient myth, but giving it this modern, secular, almost messianic spin, stolen divine power, a new dawn, but humans make it happen.
Exactly. And the new reality they wanted, it was aggressively secular and stridently simple. Not like the complex checks and balances of the American Republic.
No.
Billington contrasts that with what he calls the occult simplicity you sometimes find in revolutionary symbols. He even points to stuff on the American Great Seal, the all-seeing eye, the pyramid, Novus Ordo Seclorum.
A new order of the ages.
Yeah. He suggests that for some, these symbols hinted at a new order based on fundamental, maybe even mystical, geometric, or Pythagorean principles. A search for this underlying perfect simplicity hidden beneath the messy old world.
That's fascinating. Looking back to antiquity, not just for Roman political ideas, but for deeper, almost mystical structures.
Precisely. They reached back to pre-Christian pagan times. Some even took pagan names. And they particularly loved Pythagoras.
A mathematician.
Not just the mathematician. As the model intellectual who became a revolutionary, they were drawn to Pythagorean beliefs in the power of prime numbers, perfect geometric forms, musical harmonies.
Music, too.
Yeah, the sources note that the Strasbourg musicians who first played La Marseillaise were also introducing Mozart's magic flute, seeing its message about light vanquishing darkness as, a parallel to the revolutionary anthem's Day of Glory.
So the revolution wasn't just politics. For some, it was trying to tune the world to a perfect cosmic frequency, align it with some fundamental, simple, natural order.
That's definitely the feeling Billington gets from the material. And this revolutionary fire, he notes, it wasn't necessarily lit, in the public square at noon by some philosopher king.
No.
Its sparks often came, metaphorically, at midnight amidst the banquet excesses, hinting at origins in the less respectable, maybe more libertine, or even occult corners of society. He even traces the word communism. Not to the famous Rousseau.
No. Who them?
To Restif de la Bretonne. An eccentric writer, kind of known for his erotic imagination, described as Rousseau of the gutter.
Restif de la Bretonne. Wow. That's a surprising origin for a word that defined a massive global movement.
It is. It first showed up in his writing as what Billington calls a rough ideograph, like a signpost pointing towards a future idea, not a fully fleshed out ideology yet. In Billington's study, he says, it traces these early, sometimes obscure signs and sparks from guys like Restif all the way to Lenin, following them across borders, through networks carried by small groups, individuals, creating this incendiary legacy of ideas.
It sounds less like tracking normal history and more like following a hidden stream of thought, maybe underground sometimes.
That's exactly the approach. The study focuses intensely on this small but hugely influential subculture of revolutionaries and proto-revolutionaries. Billington is very clear. His aim isn't a comprehensive political history. or detailed biographies of big political figures, or a sociological analysis of socioeconomic pressures from below. He's also careful not to be hagiographic. He's not trying to justify or glorify the revolution.
So what is the focus?
It's exploring the genesis and spread of the revolutionary tradition itself, as an intellectual and spiritual thing. A story driven by a few key ideas and the key, often obscure, people who developed and passed them on.
Okay.
And this tradition, he notes, it was sustained, often through really tough times, loneliness, despair, by a secularized version of the Judeo-Christian belief in deliverance through history.
Ah, back to the religious connection. History as a kind of secular prophecy.
Exactly. In this view, the present world is often seen as hell. The revolutionary struggle is the necessary collective purgatory, and the successful revolution promises an earthly, secular paradise in the future.
And the French Revolution became central to that story.
Absolutely. Like the incarnation of this secular hope. Seen as betrayed by Judases, crucified by Pilates, this belief in achieving modern secular salvation, creating a totally new, perfect, man-made order through this radical act, this beginning without return. Billington argues that's unique to the age of political religion kicked off by the American and French revolutions.
Tiny.
Earlier upheavals, he says, usually just wanted to swap bad leaders for good ones, or one ruling class for another. They were revolts, rebellions. Modern revolution, in this sense, is different because it aims to create a fundamentally new order from nothing.
Not just changing the driver, but building a whole new car and hoping it gets you to utopia.
That's the ambition. And Billington stresses his study only looks at a specific, though really important part of this huge story, focusing on how this unique intellectual and spiritual tradition spread among a pretty small group, but one whose ideas would eventually shake the world.
Okay, we've got a sense of the faith, the minds it inhabited. Where did this specific modern revolutionary fire really ignite? Where was the crucible?
Billington points squarely at the city. The city is the essential crucible, specifically Paris, and later St. Petersburg. They're the primary birthplaces.
Paris first, though.
Oh, undeniably. Paris is where this tradition first got really intense. It's the city that actually overthrew its monarchy between 1789 and 92. It triggered waves of revolution across Europe in 1830, 1848, and crucially, it forged the model for social revolution during the Paris Commune in 1871.
The urban center as the lab, the pressure cooker for these radical ideas.
Yes, and as the 19th century went on, Billington argues, the leadership baton of this tradition kind of passed symbolically from Paris to St. Petersburg.
How so?
You can trace a lineage through figures like the French revolutionary Blanqui, connecting to the Russian Tkachev, whose ideas influenced the terrorists trying to kill the Tsar, which ultimately paved the way for Lenin.
And Lenin's own revolutionary start.
Billington notes, it began in a surprisingly specific place in St. Petersburg, the student dining hall and library of the Technological Institute. That's where he dug into Marx, first met actual industrial workers, and hooked up with the very first Russian revolutionary Marxists.
So St. Petersburg inherited the mantle, but the absolute origin point was Paris. And not just Paris generally. A specific place within Paris acted as the first incubator.
Exactly. The source material points right at the Palais Royal in the late 1780s.
The Palais Royal? That wasn't public land at first, was it?
No, it was the private sanctuary of the Duke of Orleans family, the liberal branch, seen as more open to reform than the main Bourbons out of Versailles. But paradoxically, this protected, semi-private space became the incubator for the very people who'd eventually snatch power from Versailles in 89 and the Tuileries Palace in 92.
Billington called it the first green zone.
Yeah, a privileged space that somehow strangely fertilized the seeds of radical opposition, helped turn intellectuals into active revolutionaries.
A space where the old rules didn't quite apply.
Exactly. The Palais Royal wasn't just a palace and garden. Its arcades had cafes. There's a circus, a big enclosed space in the middle. These spots fostered an intellectual and political opposition that, the source says, went way beyond the more polite discussions in, say, London coffee houses.
What do people call it?
Contemporaries used amazing phrases. A sort of Hyde Park of the French capital, the place where public opinion is formed, the agora of the city in ferment, the forum of the French Revolution.
Sounds like the absolute nerve center of pre-revolutionary radicalism.
And Billington pinpoints this almost theatrical moment, Sunday, July 12, 1789, around 3:3 p.m.
Okay.
Camille Desmoulins, young journalist, orator, climbs onto a table outside the famous Café Foy Poy. They called it La Table Magique, the magic table. He hears the news, The king fired the popular finance guy Necker, and Dimmolen shouts.
Arm to arms.
The spark, that connection to the slogan, from the spark comes the flame.
Yeah.
Feels so literal right there. One guy igniting a city. It absolutely does, and the reaction was instant. Dramatic. The crowd surged out, grabbed busts of Necker and the Duke of Orleans as symbols. They forced the Paris theaters to shut down, symbolically silencing the old drama. Converged on the Place Louis XV, turning it into the spontaneous theater of revolution.
And Demoulin's green ribbon.
Yeah, torn from a tree.
Yeah.
A temporary badge of nature, of hope for this growing mob.
So the Palais Royal wasn't just a place, it became the embodiment of the people in revolutionary talk, a model for mobilization.
That's the argument. Even the police saw the danger early on, August '89. It became the informal voice of revolutionary authority, where petitions got written, songs sung in the name of the citizens of the Palais Royal. One observer said, liking a king, Paris found a chief in the Palais Royal.
Wow.
And later, the political map of Paris formalized this. When they divided the city into 48 sections in 1790, the section of the Palais Royal, later renamed Montaigne, became the largest, most central one, the rumor mill.
And the cafes inside, they weren't just for coffee, right? Billington calls them votive objects of applied sciences. What's that about?
It points to this unique vibe, a mix of intellectual curiosity, revolutionary heat, and this fascination with the new scientific mechanical world. He mentions the Café Mécanique drinks served through trapdoors, supposed to illustrate Newtonian physics. The Café d'Émile Colon used mirrors for illusions, blurring reality and appearance. The Café Italien had a stove shaped like a Montgolfier balloon, and Montgolfier himself hung out there.
So it wasn't just abstract science. It was science mixing with cafes, fantasy, politics, making this idea of a radical, new, maybe engineered world feel
It's real.
tangible.
Exactly, like a space where the new rational scientific world was merging with revolutionary dreams and this sense of theater, maybe even magic. And Café Foy, where Desmoulins stood on the table, that was ground zero, a little capital of agitation within the bigger kingdom of agitation.
It even got shut down briefly.
Yeah, in '89, which just gave it this mantle of martyrdom, made it even more legit.
But the source says the Jacobins, the more disciplined ones, were suspicious of it all.
They were. The Jacobin Club, which later became the center of power during the Terror, mostly operated outside the Palais Royal. They didn't like its lack of discipline, the mixed crowds, the possible influence of the Duke of Orleans or foreigners.
Right.
Robespierre's dictatorship eventually clamped down on the Palais Royal's freedom in '93. It lost its central role as the revolution got more centralized, more austere, before Napoleon finally cleaned out the cafes and the cirque burned down.
What was the overall vibe like there in that crucible during the peak years? You said it was a mix.
Billington paints this picture of a place just pulsating. Illusion, fantasy, but also immediate gratification. The idea of total secular happiness right now seemed believable there.
Hedonism meets politics.
Yeah, a hedonistic awakening alongside intense political talk. A sense of social equality, breaking down old barriers, direct communication, people from different classes, backgrounds, mingling. Remarkably diverse, too.
Diverse.
All races represented. The sources even mention two black men, Aladdin and Scipio, who were kind of revered as fools in the wise Shakespearean sense, outsiders who could often resolve arguments.
That's an incredible detail. Sounds like a truly unique social and psychological space.
It was. The language got egalitarian, even kind of vulgar, incorporating what they call genre poissard, the fishwives' language, into journalism. Billington calls the Palais Royal fundamentally a theater, intensely verbal, revolutionary talk, iconoclastic speech, constantly performed, perfected, infecting Paris, then France. Legitimacy seemed to shift from the formal speeches in the assembly to the spontaneous voices of the people in the Palais.
And this connects to the revolution sentimental, the emotional side.
Yes, the Palais Royal was a key combustion point for that explosion of sensibility starting with Rousseau. It turned political crisis into this emotion-charged thing, public tears, embraces, passionate declarations. The personal and political, the emotional and ideological, all tangle up together there.
Okay, so from the physical space, the incubator, let's turn to how this faith spoke, how it found its voice, its symbols. Billington really stresses oracular journalism.
Absolutely. Editorial offices became revolutionary hubs, breeding grounds for ideas and action, just as important as the cafes or clubs. Journalists were suddenly center stage, a powerful fourth estate. Abby Size, a key early figure, even suggested journalism might be more important, more consequential than the official third estate, the elected representatives.
More powerful than the elected body. Wow.
Right.
Shows the perceived power of the word, written and spoken, in spreading that fire.
It really does. A prime example highlighted is the journal Père Duchesne, tied to Jacobert.
Right, the one using vulgar language.
Extremely coarse language, yeah. Speaking in the voice of the common man. Billington argues it did more than just represent the mob. It performed a crucial act of cultural revolution, the ritual desecration of authority. The profanity wasn't just for shock value. It appealed directly to the crowd and actively encouraged overthrowing not just the king, but aristocratic language itself.
Yeah.
Legitimizing forbidden acts by legitimizing forbidden words. Hebert, they said, silenced aristocratic tongues before his readers chopped off their heads.
So linguistic shock was a deliberate weapon, breaking down the old order's psychological hold.
Absolutely. Billington quotes someone saying it was the seizure of the forbidden word, that which the established order prescribes because it destroys its legitimacy. And this wasn't abstract. Hebert's paper channeled rage over food shortages, demanded radical social controls, economic redistribution, pushing way beyond politics into the social realm.
He got caught up in the terror himself, though.
Martyred by Robespierre in '94. But he and his journal were rediscovered in the 1840s, became a model for later militant journalists pushing for social change.
And Nicolas Bonneville, presented as maybe even more original.
Yeah, Billington credits him with amazing foresight and influence, even if he's often overlooked. He might have been the first to use aux armes, citoyens, to arms citizens, even before the Bastille fell.
Really?
Yeah. His early journal, Le Tribune du Peuple, published right around the Bastille events, pointed beyond the immediate action to the revolution that is being prepared, an ideological, total revolution. He looked for deliverance not just in politics, but in a republic of letters, with intellectuals leading humanity.
He did something striking with language, too, addressing the king.
He did. July 1790, eve of the Bastille anniversary. He publishes a piece using the informal tu to address the king, instead of the required formal vous, a powerful symbolic stripping away of royal authority, just through language. His later journal, La Bouche de Fer, the Mouth of Iron, published by the Social Circle starting in early 1790. It explicitly aimed to be a revolutionary catechism, a guide to the new faith. Its language was consciously taken from Parisian revolutionary speech, meant to spread out, destroy regional traditions. His buddies, like Anacharsis Clootz, the self-proclaimed orator of the human race, used spoken language similarly for communal incantation.
And his friend, the curate Claude Fauché, turned this into revolutionary sermons.
Exactly. Fauché stormed the Bastille, then stormed the pulpit, developed this new genre of revolutionary sermonizing, even in Notre Dame. His words, calling for a new kind of government, seemed to foreshadow later calls, like Lincoln's New Birth of Freedom.
And Bonneville's core message through all this.
According to the source, it was that the authority of revolutionary intellectuals should replace authoritarian politicians. He distrusted guys like Necker, Lafayette, warned against the Jacobins, fearing any société dominatrice, any dominating group.
But he also revered le peuple Dieu, the people god. What did that mean, if not just the crowd in the street?
This is where Bonneville gets kind of proto-romantic. He wasn't just reporting what ordinary people said. He was trying to articulate what he believed was a hidden language underneath.
Hidden language?
Yeah, the language of their true, inherently good desires when living naturally as brothers and friends. He pushed people like Condorcet to speak simply, argued for a language of fire, a universal language expressed through sighs and tears.
A search for pure origins, radical simplicity, fire, water, connecting Notre Dame to ancient Isis cults. It's a wild mix.
Yeah.
Mystical and revolutionary.
It is. And Billington stresses, for these journalists, words weren't just for rational argument. They were incantations, weapons to mobilize passion. They knew the secret. Not books, but words. Liberty, tyranny, despotism could move people. They used a torrent of terminology, IDs, forces, force ideas, badly defined words, rumor, on DQ.
The power of language to shatter old norms.
And legitimize new actions, recognized explicitly in '94 when censorship came in, which ironically prompted more study of language's power by those trying to control it.
And this connected to a key group, the social circle.
The social circle, described as the ultimate keeper of the flame, the most secret inner group in the Palais Royal scene, seemed to blend the Masonic idea of a purified inner circle guarding truth with Rousseau's idea of a true social contract.
Maybe linked to an earlier social club?
Possibly. Formed summer 1790 from Bonneville's Tribune meetings, explicitly sought neither masters nor disciples, suggesting an egalitarian ideal, used secret cards, fake names for the inner core, operating within a bigger patriotic circle of the Friends of Truth. Le Bouche de Fer was their hierophantic interpreter, revealing the faith's mysteries.
And they went public with the Universal Confederation of the Friends of Truth.
Yeah, huge meetings in the Cirque, the Palais Royal. Maybe 6,000 members by October 1790. Billington sees it as like a rival ideological parliament to the National Assembly. Old friends united.
Crucial international links, too.
Absolutely, through figures like Oswald, a Scot who helped spread publications, and most importantly, Thomas Paine and Joel Barlow, providing this apostolic linkage between American Republican ideas and the more radical French direction. Paine, after arriving in 91, lived with the Bonnevilles, became his closest friend.
Bonneville seemed okay with being called incendiary.
He reportedly agreed, yeah. Said he wanted to generate the warmth of universal fraternity. Billington notes the combustible material often came from foreigners. The press was the heart and soul of the social circle, keeping the idea of international egalitarian change alive. Figures like Varlet, a radical opponent of Robespierre, wrote pamphlets for them, preaching permanent insurrection, direct democracy.
But Bonneville's ultimate focus, the source says, was legitimacy, not just grabbing power.
Yes, key distinction. While factions fought for political control, Bonneville sought deeper legitimacy, establishing a new authority based on truth, the enlightened people's will, replacing the king's or the court's legitimacy.
Replacing the old court circle with a new circle of authority.
Exactly. A new cultural, ideological center. And that required powerful new symbols, rituals.
Which brings us right to those solid symbols of allegiance. The Bastille has to be first.
The architectural symbol of the old regime's arbitrary power, a condensation symbol for everything they hated. Storming it was huge, but crucially, regacing it afterwards, tearing it down completely, creating a field of nature where tradition stood that was profoundly symbolic.
Making a clear break.
Totally. Models of the demolished Bastille were sent all over France to perpetuate there the horror of despotism. The site became a tabula rasa, a blank slate, ready for new symbols.
And the first symbol put there, a statue of nature.
Yeah, enormous, sphinx-like. For the Feast of Unity in 93, the site became a rally point. Pre-dawn gatherings, singing a hymn to nature, doing this secular baptism communion thing under a fountain of regeneration representing nature. The invocation, descend, O liberty, daughter of nature.
Wow, linking liberty directly to nature, bypassing tradition.
Exactly, and the tree of liberty was the other big positive symbol.
Organic, growing.
Yeah, product of nature, symbol of regeneration, rooted in earth, reaching for heaven, representing the new order's connection to natural processes. Festivals centered around planting them, often young oaks for strength, youth. Deliberately avoiding shady trees, implying openness.
Communal activities in the sunshine.
Defying secretive tyrants. It offered an acceptable verticality, a link to something higher, enduring, amidst all the leveling equality.
There's such a strong sense of theatricality in all this, isn't there?
Absolutely. Billington really emphasizes this competition between life and stage in 18th century France. Rousseau staging his life, actors like Talma becoming huge figures. The revolution itself, he suggests, was deeply theatrical.
How so?
It changed the whole mise-en-scene, the setting, gave everyone new roles. A sense of purely theatrical equality early on, just playing the revolutionary part, gave you status. Costume was central. The artist David sketching outfits, Talma trying them on, the public adopting them. People cut their hair short, burned wigs, adopted that spasmodic nod greeting.
Which supposedly imitated the guillotine.
It underscores the profound psychological shift. The passion for theatricality, Billington writes, even extended to how victims were treated, playing with bodies, singing, dancing around the scaffold. His conclusion, the Great Revolution was as much theatrical as political. Success often depended on artistic flair, timing, performing revolutionary virtue. The people, incorrigible actors, eventually found a director in Napoleon himself called an actor who dared to teach the great Talma himself.
And the festivals themselves evolved, from gatherings to big processions.
And with that, the focus of legitimacy shifted. From space and nature, the Bastille site, the tree, to time and history, culminated dramatically with the revolutionary calendar in fall 93.
Right. Utopia wasn't just a place nowhere. It became a time, sometime.
Exactly. Time itself starts this novel, majestic, and symbol-like equality march. Nature was invoked to bless it, dating it from the autumnal equinox, September 2010, 1792, when the Republic was proclaimed. The equality literally marked in the skies. Authority passed from monarch to republic.
The calendar as a fundamental symbol, changing the rhythm of life.
Totally. Its design reflected this belief in nature's rationality, simplicity. New month names from nature, seasons, pluvio sereni, ventus windy, germinal budding, florial flowering. Got rid of the week based on creation. Sundays, saints' days replaced by feasts of natural things, trees, fruits, animals, seen as far more precious than beatified skeletons. A festival text says, here's the day when nature resumes its rights over the universe.
The Feast of the Supreme Being, June 94, sounds like the absolute pick of this attempt at a new civic religion.
It was the biggest festival. Maybe 500,000 people in the Champ de Mars. Meant to be the simplest, most pastoral. No war animals, just peaceful cows, doves. Poetry about finding virtue in the fields, talking to a flower at sunrise. A feeling of vegetable exuberance. A hopeful belief in the greening over the guillotine that the death machine would disappear under flowers. The calendar seemed to promise a life of fates. But that hope didn't last. Brutally short-lived. Weeks after that feast, Robespierre himself was guillotined. The terror ended. That utopian hope just receded. The Champs de Mars went back to military drills, later industrial fairs, eventually the Eiffel Tower Iron Totem, replacing the hoped-for natural order.
The source also mentions islands as symbolic spaces.
Yeah, places of retreat, trying out ideals. Buonroti in Corsica, Sardinia, Babeuf on the Ile de la Cite, Restif on Ile Saint-Louis.
And Billington also touches on an erotic ambience.
Yes, noting figures like Laclos, de Sade were around the Palais Royal, revolutionaries like Mirabeau, Maréchal collecting or writing pornography, even Bonneville's household, the ménage à trois with pain, suggests the radical break extended to challenging conventional morality for some, seeking liberation on all levels.
Even tracing revolutionary symbols back to sexual origins.
Yeah, Joel Barlow, Paine's friend, theorized natural sexual origins for the Tree of Liberty, the Phrygian cap linking them to ancient phallic symbols. Provocative stuff. Shows the depth of the revolutionary imagination, seeking fundamental meanings in the body, nature, as well as politics.
Okay, spaces, symbols, voice. Let's go back to the core ideals. Republicanism, nationalism, communism. The three objects of belief. How are they transformed?
Right. First, republicanism. These words, often used negatively before, got totally re-energized, made into badges of pride by the American Revolution. Paine's common sense in '76 was key. Secular millenarian vision. That line, we have it in our power to begin the world over again, captured the ambition perfectly.
But, as we said, France didn't copy the American model of balanced government initially.
No, in the French debates summer of '89, Abbé Sieyès won out. Argued for a single, powerful legislature representing the nation's unified will over the American-style checks and balances. Still, the American example, plus events in France, created this huge push for Republican government. Paine moved to Paris '91, became a citizen, passionately defended the French Revolution against critics like Burke.
Arguing it was more than just changing rulers.
Yeah, a renovation of the natural order of things, a system of principles as universal as truth. He helped start the first explicitly Republican society in Paris, edited the Republican, used the word Republican in this quasi-devotional way, Billington says, almost sacred, annoyed even the Jacobins later.
And the 1793 Constitution became a symbol itself.
Even though it never actually went into effect.
Yeah.
Drafted at the height of the fervor, carried like a holy object in processions, became this venerated model for later revolutionaries in the 19th century. And France did eventually become a republic again, 1848, 1871, created satellite republics. The tradition started as Republican constitutional conspiracies against Napoleon and the Restoration.
But you said France turned against Republicans like Paine by '93. What caused this shift?
The rise of the second big ideal, fraternity, transformed into modern nationalism. La Nation, this new all-embracing fraternity, supposed to sweep away all lesser loyalties, local, class, religion, binding everyone as enfants de la patrie, children of a common fatherland.
And it got militant.
Yeah, discovered and affirmed, not just in talk, but on the jour de gloire, the day of glory, in battle. Expressed most powerfully in the levée en masse of '93 total national mobilization for war, the prototype for modern mass conscription.
And where was this militant fraternity most powerfully born?
The sources point to Strasbourg, that city with both French and German culture, birthplace of La Marseillaise, the anthem that became the sound of this national fraternity.
How did it happen there?
Early 1792. Tense times, fear of invasion. Strasbourg got the news first about war with the Germanic monarchs. The bilingual mayor, Friedrich Dietrich, who had this liberal salon, he asked a young engineering captain, Rouget de Lille, to write a marching song for the mixed French-German army of the Rhine.
And Rouget de Lille wrote it,
Yeah.
famously, overnight.
Yes, and it just hit.
Immediately.
Rallied people with the force of, Luther's hymns rallying Protestants, originally called Chant de guerre de l'Armée du Rhin. those bloodthirsty lines, sung with passion by volunteers from Marseille, which is how it got its name.
The musical culture in Strasbourg must have helped.
Incredibly rich, German and French influences. Orchestras, choirs, instrument makers like Pleyel. They had other revolutionary songs too, like the Pleyel Rouge de Lisle, Hymn of Liberty. They even pioneered using the audience as a chorus back in '91. Rouge de Lisle's own austere words in the Marseillaise, renouncing profane gaiety, soft voluptuousness, hint at a kind of revolutionary Puritanism too.
The song wasn't just music, it was a weapon, a prayer.
Its impact was huge. Electrified the nation going to war. Composers in Paris used it. Women depicted kneeling before liberty statues singing Amour sacre de la patrie, like a prayer, then rising with percussion that sounded like it would make the pavement leave the street. Another composer called it musique à coup de canon, music like cannon fire.
Believing in music's power.
Absolutely. So much so that later, when priests tried to restore Catholicism, they apparently banned melody, allowing only bleak plain song, maybe fearing that evocative power.
And that chilling link between the music and the terror.
Yeah, Billington points out the guillotine first used in Paris, April 25, 1792, made by a piano maker from Strasbourg. Almost the exact day Rouge de Lisle finished the Marseillaise, music kept building in Strasbourg during the Terror.
And this French nationalism had an unexpected German connection, through figures like Eulogia Schneider.
Schneider, what a figure. Terrifying. German emigre, ex-monk, ex-luminist, became a professor in Strasbourg, taught the writer Nodier, original, imaginative, violent, led the radical overthrow of Mayor Dietrich, wrote the first German Marseillaise, edited extremist journals, founded La Propagande, a unit for revolutionary indoctrination, became chief prosecutor of the Revolutionary Tribunal.
Nodier, his student, was aesthetically fascinated by the executions.
He was. Described the propagandist in red hats, sashes, knives, lecturing the crowd before the scaffold, even bowing to it, praising the guillotine for liberty. Nodier said he broke out in a cold sweat watching. The terror hit Strasbourg early and hard, under siege August '93. Schneider took over the German theater for his HQ. Popularized enunciation, insisted on revolutionary language, like using inn, not hotel.
And German writers brought a certain sensibility into French nationalism.
Yes, German sometimes seen as the lost language of nature, needing recovery. Linked to that search for pure origins, the language of sighs and tears. Compound words like people do, people God, imported from German philosophy into French revolutionary talk. Other Germans contributed to Seefair, the Vandal, Rebelin, the Frey brothers defending the Terror.
So French nationalism, this new fraternity, surprisingly drew on German romantic ideas.
That's the argument. Legitimacy shifted from city to nation, and this nation sometimes spoke with the German accent, shaped by a romantic view of Germany as the last country of poesy and belief, future cradle of a strong society.
And Socius is presented as the ultimate embodiment of this militant national fraternity.
Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just, the saint from Picardy, sent to Strasbourg, fall '93. City was down, terror inside, Germans outside. In just over 2 months, he does this incredible thing, curbs extremists, fires up the masses, leads the soldiers who turn back the invaders, literally save the revolutionary nation. Billington sees him as the quintessential young revolutionary. Only 26, prototype for the ascetic revolutionary, living embodiment of militant male fraternity.
Quoted saying love is a frivolous need, channeled everything into the revolution.
Exactly. Raised mainly by women, maybe lacking strong male bonds early on, seemed to pour all his energy into the organizational, ideological side things he felt politicians ignored. Withdrew from the old order's pettiness, sought pure new beliefs, wrote Spirit of the Revolution, Nature Outdoors on Tables, returned to Paris, elected to convention Sep '92, saw it as the point toward which everything is compressed, believed the legislator wasn't a debater but an oracle, a pontifex bridge between higher truth and confused people, assigned himself that role.
Became a powerful voice for executing the king.
His argument was notably impersonal, chillingly detached. Saw the monarch not as a person, Louis Capet, but as the king of kingdoms, a counter-symbol to the new sovereign nation. Had to be removed. Argued against compassion which involuntarily corrupts one's energy. Pushed the convention to the point of no return. His speech calling for revolutionary dictatorship, October '93, denounced traditional government as a world of paper, bureaucracy killing action, demanded laconicism, brevity, impossible to govern without laconicism, saw the demon of writing as the enemy.
Believed misfortune came from the vicissitude of passions, uncontrolled emotions.
Yes, and saw terror as the only passion providing constancy before virtue could take root. Terror not just punishment, but a tool to fan popular energy, audacity. Yet despite this austerity, he loved music, sang Italian songs heading to Strasbourg, left behind a lost opera, C'est le Coeur Negre, about two brothers, close friends, slaying a tyrant, embodying that masculine comradeship ideal.
Clearly linked this masculine fraternity to the nation idea.
His first mission, Spring '93, to find the nation, is not at all the sun. It is the community of affections. His posthumous writings envision an ideal society promoting this brothers-in-arms bond almost erotically. Public declarations of friendship at 21. Rituals. Leaving a friend needs public explanation, maybe banishment. Friends fight together, responsible for each other's crimes. Buried together, united for life and death.
Truly embodied that militant male fraternity.
His message to Robespierre from Alsace. Too many laws, too few examples. Summed up his call for action, personal example. Final months. Strictest austerity avoided women. Led the fight against indifference, factions. Known for his icy calm, sang-froid through violence. The serenity of total surrender to an ideal, the spirit of the revolution. Human regeneration.
A cold passion, you said.
Imploding into intelligence, not exploding into indulgence. Billington charts his toughness in the committee's final weeks. Resisted Robespierre's peace moves. Tried appealing directly to the army over the convention to stop the conservative drift. Billington notes his heroes like Augustus Caesar, mysterious references to Cromwell, Robespierre comparing him to Charles IX, St. Bartholomew's Day massacre king. Suggests this just saint, seeking no personal power, maybe felt compelled by his ideal to justify absolute power. That sublime contradiction. Tyranny of virtue needed to prevent tyranny of vice.
From fraternity and Saint-Just, let's move to equality. The vision of community leading to proto-communist ideas.
The idea of common happiness through radical redistribution, maybe abolishing private property, that proto-communist idea showed up early. Often in cosmopolitan Paris circles, not so much among Jacobins, who are usually wary of attacking property directly.
James Rutledge, the citizen of the universe.
Yeah, petitioned in 1790 on the agrarian laws, urged no ownership of property.
The idea of lex agraria, like the Roman Gracchus brothers and land reform.
Yes. Pushed by people like Abbé Fauché, Bonneville's partner in the social circle, popular with provincial clergy who saw rural suffering. Abbé Cournot, the Red Curate, went further. In the state of nature, the domain of man is the entire earth. Landowners get equal plots, non-hereditary, non-transferable, a kind of religious fervor identifying with the masses, seeking social ideals beyond politics, suggesting secular salvation through equality.
Pierre d'Olivier sounds like he embodied that radical humility.
Billington calls him almost saintly in self-deprecation. Petitioned the Bonneville Fauché group, calling himself lowliest of men, simple, without knee breeches and without a hearth, sans culotte et sans feu, identifying with the property lists, but not without passion for the kingdom of universal justice.
And François-Noël Babeuf, another from Picardy like Saint-Just, seems he connected this universal ideal to real French rural grievances.
Babeuf started differently. Young prisoner, trained as land deeds guy, not initially political, led a local tax revolt 90. Paris is where he found the agrarian law idea, via Rutledge, the Universal Confederation. Gave ideology to primitive local ideas about collective land use, collective lease, redistributing church lands. Opposed moderate revolution, attacked Lafayette in the Palais Royal. Even planned a radical feminist confederation des dames, maybe with a Universal Confederation.
After the Jacobins fell, he developed a new model for organizing.
Yeah, moved away from the Jacobin club model, too passive, like a church congregation. His manifesto, November 4, on the need and means of organizing a true popular society, called for a militant, disciplined society, explicitly to end the aristocracy of riches, start the reign of republican virtues.
Prison seems key for him developing these ideas.
Spent 6 months in Arras prison, 1795. Used the time to refine his popular society ideas. Expanded beyond just land to include collective commerce, agriculture, and importantly, industry significant for the time, looking ahead to later socialism. Even outlined completing the revolution in a letter, July 95. Anticipated a secure base area for militants, Vendée, Sacred Mountain, the plebeian Vendée, flipping counter-revolutionary symbols.
He used the term phalanxes.
Yes, for the social military units needed for the discipline of his communauté, his community. The term had history and revolutionary talk, phalanxes, interpreters, etc. A disciplined body, united purpose.
Led to the Club of the Pantheon.
Met by torchlight, late 95. Called Cave of Brigands. Discussed Babeuf's Tribune program. Babeuf returned to Paris at 95, took charge. maybe 2,000 members, accused of starting civil war, rich versus poor. Babeuf's classic reply, war already exists, accepted being called anarchists, men who want to be always making revolution.
And the Manifesto of the Equals, secretly by Marshall, became their program.
Published November 1995, laid out the Communist Revolution Plan, called for common enjoyment of the earth's fruits and private property, stated bluntly. Revolution is necessary. General upheaval in property ownership is inevitable. Revolt of the poor against the rich is a necessity that nothing can prevent.
Babeuf himself got kind of messianic.
He did. Invoked Moses, Joshua, Jesus, Rousseau, Robespierre, Saint-Just, called Christ a co-athlete for equality, wrote a new history of the life of Jesus Christ in prison, arguing Jesus was a sans-culotte. The influence of the Red Curates made it important to grapple with Christian ideas, sometimes trying to stop them weakening dedication. Klutz attacked Fauché for praising Puritan levelers, attacked Christianity itself, praised nature's certainty over the gospel's ambiguities.
Their chosen ancient model, Spartans?
Yes, Babeuvists adopted Spartans.
Yeah.
Militant, ascetic, land-based, hostile to cerebral, commercial, Paris, Athens. Conspiracy had foreign links, too. Batavian Republic, Netherlands. Officially adopted liberty, equality, fraternity 95. Dutch revolutionaries involved. Echoes in Italy, Poland.
Italian collaborators like Cerise and Buonarroti tried to connect.
They did. Sought Paris directory support for popular movements in Italy for a general revolution, unitary state. Argued against French military rule for prompt formation of popular authorities, often ignored by the French military, like Napoleon invading Italy. Buonarroti's friend bitterly noted Italian villages welcoming the French with Catholic masses, showing the gap between the elite's secular vision and popular religion.
Okay, back to the word itself. Where exactly did communism come from, per Billington?
Billington traces communiste, appearing in print first to Restif de la Bretonne. In 1785, Restif reviewed a book about a communal experiment near Marseille. The book's author, Huppé de Fouveia, an educational theorist, had called himself an auteur communiste in a 1782 letter cited in the book Restif reviewed.
So not a political track, but describing an experiment.
Exactly. Huppé had this detailed blueprint, 1779, Project for a Philosophical Community. Billington calls it the first full blueprint. Mix of utopian ideas, Moravians, Morelli, Rousseau, communal education to age 5, no prejudice, rigid schedules, Plato statues, even this weird idea of a privileged exit for kids marrying inside the community, creating a philosophical master race for perfect sociability.
Later proposed a Republican Koran, green uniforms.
Yeah, shows the mix of radical secularism and trying to create new revolutionary rituals. And Restif could point his correspondent asking about Huppé to his own earlier works, Andrew Grave, 1782, Le Paysan Perverti, 1776, which also had communist ideas.
Billington suggests communism might have been wind from America blowing back. How?
Huppé's project, Restif's Paysan, conceived around 1776, American Revolution year. Restif wrote that the people of Brothers of Philadelphia, Penn City, the revolutionaries opened the possibility for a union, community ending vain and external distinction. Spoke of a supranational community ending rivalry.
Restif seemed really committed to this lonely vision.
He did. Intensified over years, traced it back to 82. Printed his own books, small editions. Talked about his ideal society, like visiting Venus. Final Fantasy, The Cage and the Birds is lost. But his Philosophie de Monsieur Nicolas, 1796, explicitly called for Communauté universelle, universal community, talking about the communists as active figures, the link between Restif's vision and Babeuf's conspiracy. Debated. Occult labyrinths, Billington calls it.
And the first Russian comment on Restif's communism was early.
Yeah, Radishchev, Journey from Petersburg to Moscow, 1790. Blasted Restif's version for libertarian excess, sexual permissiveness, maybe hinting, Billington suggests, at the more ascetic, puritanical Russian version to come.
Billington thinks Babeuf borrowed heavily from Bonneville, too.
Yes, strong reasons. Babeuf admired Bonneville, 8990, adopted the Tribune title function, used journalism in that oracular, mobilizing way. Conspiracy posters hinted at 89 precedents, uprising beyond politics, social goals, Bonner common, assigned leadership to women like Bonneville's earlier feminist plans. The whole idea of a reporter network, secret inner circle, echoes Bonneville's social circle.
And the mystery around Marshall, secret author of the Manifesto, may be explained by Illuminist secrecy.
One possibility Billington explores, given secret society influence, plausible they had a secret inner core. Maybe saw Marshall as the flame at the center of the circle protected. He is a Theopolis and l'HSD, l'homme sans Dieu, man without God, as the ideal. Directly matches the highest Illuminist grade ideal, Areopagites, Man perfect as God without God.
So these militant egalitarian ideas got traction after the Jacobins fell during economic crisis.
Yes, radical solution to suffering. And Bonneville stayed active, influential until 1800. Napoleon shut his journal. Bonneville compared Napoleon to Cromwell, a betrayer. Billington suggests a common thread linking these figures and ideas. Romantic occultism, which leads to the often hidden organizational roots of the revolutionary tradition.
Ah, the secret societies. It seems like better political police pushed these movements underground.
Exactly. Under Napoleon, then the conservative restoration, open dissent was squashed. So conspiratorial societies, with hierarchy, discipline, became the main form of revolutionary organization. They fueled the 1820s revolutions across Europe. Billington says historians struggle with this tangled threads, lack of documents.
But the reality, by mid-1810s, tons of these secret groups.
Scores. Across Europe, Latin America, Middle East. Often local but shared ideas, methods. Internationalized the tradition. Provided forums to debate power after traditional legitimacy collapsed. And pioneered impatient youth-forming organizations against authority. Billington says historians often neglect this. Evidence leads into uncongenial territory for modern rationalist views.
And his thesis, this modern revolutionary tradition, especially organizationally, grew out of occult Freemasonry.
That's his core argument here. Early organizational ideas came less from practical politics, more from things like Pythagorean mysticism. Key innovators, often literary intellectuals, influenced by German Romanticism, especially Bavarian Illuminism.
Let's look at Buonarroti again, Michelangelo's descendant, presented as a prototype.
Yes, Philippe Buonarroti. Florentine noble family, oldest son, expected traditional path, but impoverished, noble, stagnant city, sought satisfaction in the mind. Aptitude for French, language of progress, and music, language of longing. Billington calls him prototypical radical intellectual, gifted, self-indulgent, restless, drawn to politics.
Early travels were formative.
Law at Pisa. Early radical thoughts, maybe from a trip to Marseille, 1780, shocked by poverty, stimulated by cosmopolitan vibe. Back in Pisa, influenced by Rousseau Morelli followers. Took up journalism late 1786. Short-lived weekly in Florence. Combated superstition, awakened political consciousness. Published in French, language of enlightenment, in the style of English gazettes.
And he refined two central myths.
Yes, through his career. One, the uncompleted revolution, kept alive partly by cultivating Babeuf's memory, pioneering new organization methods. Two, finding perfect alternative society in nature, moving beyond sentimentality to practicality, especially on islands Corsica, Sardinia.
He was in Corsica 1790-92, same time Babeuf was thinking agrarian ideas.
Yeah. Published a patriotic journal of Corsica, defended French Revolution in Rousseau terms, seeking general happiness in nature he saw there.
After a failed Sardinia expedition, he went to Paris.
Late 92. Made French citizen. Argued successfully for Corsica's incorporation as Isola della Libertà, Island of Liberty, before the convention, April 93. Became infatuated with Paris, the revolutionary city. Believes it had magic, lifting people from private concerns to shared passion, fusing personal interests into a common one.
But feared betrayal from within.
Experience made him wary. Wrote The Corsican Conspiracy Entirely Unmasked, 1794. Warned against rich egoists, enemies of equality betraying things, blamed great treasons on lack of holy enthusiasm for the new community. Denounced Paoli, Corsican leader turned opportunist, called for a new man to complete the revolution, said there was great need for a great courage, prophetic, given the terror.
Insisted he never belonged to any party.
Yes, defending himself during the terror. Claimed he was above factions, serving only the universal cause. Billington sees this anticipating the authentic revolutionary posture, serving a higher ideal. By 1796, after Italy, Babeuf connection. His focus shifted from sentimental nature to revolutionary law. Obligation is the way to the ideal.
And this leads to Illuminism's influence on secret organization ideas.
Billington sees occult Freemasonry as the main source for modern secret societies. Masonry offered ritual fraternity, upward mobility outside tradition, let even conservatives dream of utopia, respectably. Duke of Orleans, Palais Royal owner, headed French Masonry. Many Palais Royal revolutionaries were Masons. But the specific revolutionary secret society model hierarchy ideology came more from the Order of Illuminists.
Were founded in Bavaria, Adam Weishaupt.
May 1st, 1776. Secret, hierarchical. Modeled explicitly on Jesuit structure, discipline, but dedicated to radical Rousseauian vision, moral perfection, freedom from religious to political authority.
And they used Freemasonry to recruit.
Yes. Weishaupt joined Masonry 77, recruited inside lodges, pool of members, cover, Berenig, big occult figure, joined Illuminists 1780, hugely expanded recruitment in Germany, targeted higher Masonic orders like strict observance, discredited rivals claiming Jesuit control, unknown superiors, presented themselves as the true path.
Complex hierarchy.
Yes, three main classes, grades within. First two, novice, minerval, etc., mirrored Masonic stages, the church. Third administrative class had synod, epopt, regent, and the top secret grade, Areopagites.
And the Areopagites were the ultimate ideal.
The totally secret inner circle, highest grade. Symbols discarded for pure natural liberty, equality via ennobling of motives, restoring social contract. Their meetings were the nucleus of a new world, practicing inner politics as the model. Goal: free man entirely from external authority, live in egalitarian harmony, guided only by reason, natural law.
But the order was quickly suppressed.
Radical aims terrified German establishment churches, monarchs. Persecution led to formal dissolution 1785-87, Weishaupt banished. But the diaspora of members, 2,500 peak, led to wider, often underground posthumous impact.
And in France, it sparked fascination, not fear.
Paradoxically, yes. Bavarian police published Weishaupt's documents 87 to expose them. Instead, created huge fascination in France. An essay describing them 88 fueled it more. Billington notes wryly, even the Palais Royal's erotic imagination couldn't top the alleged initiation, ritual description, blood marks, bound testicles, phantoms drinking blood. Illuminist influence on French radical thought, quickly recognized.
Figures like Mirabeau brought the ideas over.
Yes, Mirabeau encountered Illuminism in Germany, brought back the concept of universal revolution via hidden hand. Bonneville's 1788 book, Jesuits Driven from Freemasonry, developed the Weishaupt idea of Jesuit infiltration, need for new pure order against tyrants priests. This Illuminist ideal interested key French figures, Saint-Just, Desmoulins, Picardy, Dietrich, Schneider, Strasbourg. German emigres in Paris included ex-Illuminists like Seyffer, Frey Brothers, Rebmann.
And occult Illuminist influence visible in Babeuf's later communist goals.
Billington finds strong evidence. Babeuf invited friend to enter into the sacred mysteries of agrarianism, accepted fidelity from follower called Chevalier de l'Ordre des Égaux, Knight of the Order of Equals. Conspiracy outline spoke of circle of adherence, advancing by degree, transforming world from pays lamotrophies, bordering lands, out-echoes Illuminist hierarchy, expansion goals. Secret hierarchical setup resembled Illuminists and Bonneville.
And the mystery about Marechal's role in Babeuf's plot could be linked.
Yes. Strange lack of references to Marechal by Babeuf, others, despite his key role writing the manifesto, could be deliberate Illuminist-type secrecy about the inner core. As mentioned, Marechal's ideal l'homme sans Dieu in Aethiopolis closely matched the Illuminist Areopagite goal of man perfect as God without God. Maybe they saw him as the philosophical flame at the center, protected by secrecy.
Buonarroti was also fascinated by Illuminism early on.
Yes. Noted their struggle with Catholicism in Bavaria 1787, before French Revolution. Hint of commitment in forgotten 1789 journal by Italian students in Bavaria influenced by Illuminism. Buonarroti himself drew plans in Innsbruck, called Samos, for journal promoting total transformation Illuminist ideal. His 1789 political appendix might be first ideological revolutionary organ.
Beyond Illuminism, you mentioned Pythagorean mysticism. How did that influence organization?
Illuminism provided structure. Pythagoreanism offered symbol philosophical justification for seeking simple, perfect order and embodying it organizationally. Revolutionaries seeking fundamental principles sometimes turned to Pythagorean beliefs, power, perfection of prime numbers, geometric forms. Pythagoras seen as model action-oriented intellectual.
Prime numbers, especially 5.
Yes, 1, 3, 7, above all 5. Important in Pythagorean mysticism, not just abstract. Billington notes Counter-Revolutionary 1797 saw these as secret code, focused on 17. Bonneville on left linked 17 to Jesuits taking over Masonry. Both sides use these symbols.
So Pythagorean passion seriously influenced how they thought about organizing.
It did. Illuminists using occult Masonry for conspiracy, drawing on Masonic geometric rituals pointed way for Bonneville, Buonarroti. Wild symbols and occult circles fed broader impulse, search for simple nature geometry forms as touchstone for truth, model for rational society. Manic search for geometric harmonies in Masonry's 1770s, 80s revealed this thirst for revolutionary simplification.
And this spilled into political life.
Absolutely. Occultists became politicians. Used Pythagorean symbol circle, triangle, also Christian divinity symbols, dominant in higher Masonry, utopian architecture. Revolutionary leaders saw themselves as Mason architects, virtue reason fighting Rococo excess with rule of geometry, mastering math laws like Newton's gravity, circular harmony, meant possessing secret of solar universe, organizing society rationally. German occultism saw man as dynamic living point destined to become a circle, vision growing without end.
Bonneville's vision of global transformation fits this.
It does. Illuminist model spreading via magic circles from central social circle to wider Cercle du Peuple Franc. Even as hopes faded late 1790s, figures like Bonneville, Paine, Maréchal clung to Pythagoras' image exiled but relevant intellectual building brotherhood on simple truths.
Thomas Paine living with the Bonnevilles sounds key.
It was. 1797-1802. Paine got convinced Druids Pythagoreans offered a cult alternative to Christianity, believed their sun worship diverted into Masonry. After return to America, wrote essay on origin of Freemasonry, Bonneville translated, pushing this ancient occult source idea.
St. Martinism also connected.
Louis-Claude de Saint-Martin, mystic. Social Circle published his crypto-revolutionary works 1792. Foe of Enlightenment rationalism saw revolution as chance to build New Jerusalem via Pythagorean forms numbers. Vision of radiant sun over Charis from whence it spreads universal light. New man perceives light contemplating concentric circles converging on point, candle flame, reintegrating with elements. Man moves toward pure spirit. Revolutionary democracy becomes deocracy.
This Pythagorean dream seems particularly influential in early Russian-Polish revolutionary activity.
Yes, post-Napoleon era. Vilnius student groups, nocturnal meetings, nature, arch-eliminated visitor, free Pythagorean traditions spread in Polish-influenced areas. Society of Pythagoras founded West Ukraine, May 1818, 3 young Russians. Rules of Pythagorean sect, 3 concentric circles, third of Plato's Republic. Led to Society of United Slavs, Hellenic ideal, Russified grades, brothers, men, boyars. Russian radicals debated rival laws of Pythagoras, no private property versus weapons friendship versus moral perfection, create people for the laws.
The Green Lamp Circle, linked to Decembrist revolt, had these elements.
Leader wrote Utopian St. Petersburg 300 years future, Tsarism orthodoxy overthrown, society organized by Pythagorean forms, circular temple, white marble altar, open arch, music only art, Phoenix replaces eagle. Pushkin, early member, referred to it. Beloved equality sat in Phrygian cap by a round table. Deep fascination with dedication, sacrifice, and magic circle. Masonic song about dying for liberty in sacred circle. German mystics like Bader wrote on Pythagorean square in nature, 1798. Linking elements energized by point of sunrise to dot and equilateral triangle used on seals.
So what were they ultimately trying to build with these models, occult ideas, secret groups?
The driving vision. The Philadelphian fantasy, building a universal community of brotherly love, Philadelphia. The Circle of Philadelphians, conceived by Nodier 1797, built later, became first key group after Babeuf conspiracy. Epitomized occult conspiracy of Napoleonic era, anticipated later movements.
The name Philadelphia itself has layers.
It does. Sanction of Revelation, Book of Revelation cities. Promise of Revolution, William Penn City, American Revolution 76. Word got associations from Old World occultism, New World ferment. Occult lodges blended these. Lodge of Nine Sisters, Paris, founded by Kurt de Gebelin, Swiss Protestant pastor, proto-romantic German influence. De Gebelin's Monde Primitif sought primordial language, symbols, read ritually, advocated single political order, single grammar, eternal religion, rejected words for things implying social reform.
And this blend became literal with Benjamin Franklin.
Franklin, from real Philadelphia, arrived Paris 76. Initiated into Nine Sisters by Kurt de Gebelin, became master. Collaborated on politics. Lodge printed U.S. Constitution's first school of constitutionalism in Europe, Billington says. Others like Moreau de Saint-Marie involved. Name Philadelphia spread as symbol of subversive internationalism. Brissot accused of trying to make Paris a new Philadelphia. Hotel near Palais Royal where international revolutionaries met, nicknamed Hotel de Philadelphie. Klutz, Kurt's collaborator, foretold Nine Sisters creating citizens of the world. Immense circle in Paris radiating everywhere, foresaw France becoming universal Philadelphia.
Nodier's pentagon was another geometric model for organizing.
Yes, 5-sided figure, occult symbol for universal love. Nodier used it for first opposition cells in Napoleon's army, the Philadelphians. 5-man groups, conceived plans 1797, exiled in Besançon, renamed Philadelphia, developed Pythagorean mania for 5. Mystic figure, mean number 1 to 9, revolutionary significance, 5 sensculotides, calendar days, 5-man directory government.
Philadelphians seen as guardians of revolutionary spirit.
Yes, guardians of festive purity, sensculotides, potential counter-directory, Pentagon plan, sign of friendship, 5-pointed star, 5 engraved seal, initiations 5 p.m, 5th day, face-setting sun, 5 minutes, renew vows, power to revise statutes to 5 oldest brothers. Nodier had fascinating affinity for extremes. Vendean royalists, Vendée of honor, felt Jacobinism and the Vendée provided all the moral elevation in France, hated the juste milieu, compromised politics.
Music played a role here too, expressing aspirations.
Yes, for Borderodi, Angeloni,
Yeah.
melodies and melodramas, yeah, expressing aspiration, emotion, not just intellect. Jacob Katz, Dutch figure, influenced Marx's circle, Communist League, used Pythagoras' pseudonym, projected ideal and drama, the earthly paradise, flooded with music, created first popular Flemish music theater, central in Brussels, 1848 revolution.
So we've traced this incredibly complex web, ideas, symbols, spaces, organizations, drawing from classical antiquity, nature mysticism, occultism, journalism, theater, geometry.
It's a deep dive into how radical belief systems get forged. And Billington highlights this powerful, often unsettling dynamic throughout, the dangerous dance of extremes. Les extrêmes se touchent, the extremes touch. Used by Mercier, friend of Bonneville, Restif, Nodier. Not just a saying, points to real affinity, unconscious borrowing between far right and far left.
Not just opposition, influencing each other.
Yes, two styles, dialectical and symbiotic. Dialectical,
Defo.
radical, secular illuminists, left, got universal mission sense, secret hierarchy method from conservative Christian Jesuits.
Right.
Using Jesuit methods against Jesuit goals, counter-conspiracy. Illuminist propaganda spread fear of secret Jesuit plot. Weishaupt himself accused of being secret Jesuit. Ironically, got more revolutionary converting conservatives from higher masonry.
Strange inversion, borrowing the enemy's blueprints.
It is symbiotic.
Yeah.
Broader revolutionaries borrowed from reactionary pseudo-chivalric higher Masonic orders. Interaction got closer under Napoleon. Restoration. Monarchists, Republicans collaborating against Bonaparte, later Bourbons, in secret societies, borrowing from each other.
Pre-revolutionary example, Rousseau's cult and Court de Gebelin.
Rousseau's literary cult became political. Court de Gebelin's Rousseauist work may be less influential than reactionary attacks on it. Abbé Le Gros's analysis, 1786, meant to expose Court unintentionally revived interest, suggesting he codified Rousseau's subversive ideas for greatest of revolutions.
Later examples, counter-revolutionary Joseph de Maistre.
De Maistre. Complex. Ex-Illuminist sympathizer, almost orator in assembly, converted became Jesuit champion. Seemed to take positive ideal of strong authority from Mirabeau's negative portrayal of Catholicism. His considerations on France, 1796, showed hypnotic fascination with revolution, uniquely insisted on its absolute novelty, agreeing with revolutionaries, while calling for violent papal restoration.
And Maréchal from the far left echoed de Maistre from the right.
Incredibly, Maréchal's 1798 memo to Napoleon argued for similar militant dictatorship, but from left, praised war, warned against peace before regeneration, called on Napoleon to lead revolution forward like de Maistre urged Pope to lead counter-revolution back. Maréchal's Catherine II's Political Testament, 1801, political classic, deepens mystery about him, shows deep understanding of far-right thinking, maybe movement between extremes.
Catherine's advice in that text is chilling.
It is. Maréchal puts advice in her mouth. Prevent revolution by waging war far away. Focus is discontent. All shall then be permissible, as long as your arm shall be victorious. Control press. Cannot do what one wills with a reasoning people. Keep intellectuals in check. Form state within state. Prevent public publishing of advice. Core strategy. Dazzle public with magic of throne. Keep breathless with activity. Wars, parades, festivals. Do not leave the people time to think.
Identifies key threats.
Both armed confederations, like Poland, and unarmed confederations, clubs, societies. Advice. Maintain sang-froid, icy calm, indifference to individuals, be above all men, model nature, abandoning beings it no longer needs, sees egalitarianism as dangerous, denounces vile magistrates of the people writing equality on decrees, advise princes to outshine them, not match populist appeal.
This polarization, pulling to extremes, became typical during Restoration.
It did. Figures like Paul Didier, started arch-royalist, moved to revolutionary camp rather than support post-1815 constitutional monarchy, sought sacred goal, saw revolution as only means left, denounced by royalists for betraying all governments, defended himself as serving higher ideal. Correspondence between de Maistre and Lamennais, moving from ultramontane to ultra-democratic faith, captures this closing middle ground. Lamennais wrote to de Maistre just before his death, 1821, prophetically, "There will be no more middle way between faith and nothingness. Everything is extreme today. There is no longer any dwelling place in between." That quote feels like a powerful endpoint for the trajectory we've been tracing. This revolutionary faith seeking absolute, simple truths, total transformation, often pushing people, movements toward radical extremes.
Wow, okay. That was an incredibly detailed, really revealing deep dive into the intellectual, the spiritual origins of this revolutionary faith, drawing heavily on Billington's work. We've seen how it wasn't just about politics, but this unique belief system among intellectuals, driven by ideals like liberty, fraternity, equality, redefined in radical, sometimes clashing ways. We explored the crucial role of places like the Palais Royal as incubators, the power of new media like oracular journalism, and the force of symbols, the Bastille site, the Tree of Liberty, the calendar drawn from antiquity, nature.
Right, embodying the new
We
ideas.
looked at how republicanism, nationalism, proto-communism were championed by figures like Saint-Just, Babeuf, the surprising origin of communism itself.
Yeah, Steve.
And we dug into that often hidden influence of occult ideas, Pythagorean mysticism, secret organizational models like Illuminists, Philadelphians, including that fascinating kind of unsettling dynamic, des extrêmes se touchent.
It really highlights how these radical movements are deeply rooted in belief, intellectual ferment, a search for new authority, new community, drawing on this complex, often unexpected mix of traditions, symbols, not just material conditions, a fire in the mind seeking a new, total order.
So what does this all mean for you, listening today? These origins, these patterns, they aren't just dusty history. They reveal fundamental ways passionate beliefs become engines for huge, sometimes destructive change.
Yeah, how symbols get power, how language becomes a weapon, how even chasing universal ideals can involve these complex, sometimes hidden dynamics.
Do you see echoes of this tension between universal ideals like equality or community and how they get applied, maybe leading to extreme methods in movements now?
It does raise a big question for you to think about, doesn't it? Given this journey we trace from seeking perfect simplicity in geometry and nature to militant hierarchical groups borrowing from Jesuits, Masons, does the very quest for a totally new, simple, secular order maybe contain an inherent tendency towards extreme methods, extreme outcomes?
Or maybe think about this. How do today's movements, the ones seeking fundamental social or political change, how do they, consciously or unconsciously, echo these historical patterns? The beliefs, the symbols, the ways of organizing we saw in those first modern revolutionaries.
Just pondering those questions might give you a different lens, a different way to look at the forces trying to change our world.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine standing in Paris, say, March 1814. The world, well, it felt like it was resetting.
Right. Napoleon Bonaparte, this figure who had just dominated Europe, pushing boundaries, spreading ideas. He's defeated.
And the monarchies he challenged, they're rushing back, eager to rewind the clock, put out those revolutionary fires that started back in 1789.
For a moment, it really seemed like that revolutionary flame was just snuffed out.
And yet, if you look closely at what happened next, especially drawing from the source material we have here, it's quite different.
Absolutely. That flame, it didn't just survive. It immediately rekindled. It sort of went underground, transforming, adapting, popping up in new, sometimes really surprising forms.
So the revolutionary tradition wasn't crushed. It just entered this new phase, intense activity, reinvention.
Exactly.
So, welcome to our deep dive. We're going to explore that remarkable landscape that emerged across Europe after the Napoleonic Wars.
And based only on these specific sources, we'll try to uncover how that revolutionary tradition persisted, how its ideals shifted, maybe from universal liberty towards national identity.
And clashed with these newer ideas about social equality.
Right, and we'll see the fascinating ways that culture, everything from secret symbols to public opera, even mass journalism, got deeply tangled up with this push for radical change.
Our mission here is really to cut through the complexity, pull out the key insights from these texts for you.
We want you to understand this vital evolution in the 19th century that shift from, say, small secret conspiracies
to attempts at mobilizing mass movements.
Yeah, and the complex, often competitive interplay between nationalism, liberalism, socialism, and those early ideas of communism.
Think of this deep dive as your shortcut, maybe, to understanding the foundational DNA of so many modern political movements and ideologies.
Okay, so let's begin right there, in the immediate aftermath. After Napoleon's fall, roughly 1815 to 1825.
The sources call this the conspiratorial seedbed. On the surface, yeah, the Congress of Vienna seemed to have restored the old order, this world restored.
Kings were back, revolutionary hopes seemed, well, pretty dashed. It's quite poignant that even Babeuf's son reportedly committed suicide then, feeling the cause was lost.
And you even see symbols of this despair in the bureaucracy. Simon Duplay, who'd spent decades compiling dossiers, He had this detailed green book, apparently.
Along revolutionary conspiracies since the 1790s.
He actually burned his archive in 1814. He thought the need for this inventory of troublemakers was, over.
But here's the twist, almost comical according to the sources.
Right. Dupleix was immediately put back to work by the restored Bourbons, tasked with compiling another archive.
He ended up collecting something like 15,000 dossiers on these underground groups.
And the sources emphasize this resurgence wasn't just a repeat. It was often more elaborate, sometimes quite fanciful compared to earlier efforts.
He was even suspicious of groups like the Masonic Association of Misraim, this incredibly elaborate, supposedly Egyptian rite.
But what's really crucial about this decade, 1815, 1825, is that it gives rise to a new generation of revolutionaries.
The sources identify them as, arguably, the first political youth movement of modern times.
And critically, they were mobilizing mass followings, maybe for the first time, behind national goals, not just universal ones.
That's a significant shift from the focus on universal rights in the original French Revolution. National identity became this powerful new organizing principle, even if universalism didn't vanish.
And Napoleon himself, paradoxically, left this deep imprint.
Whether they fought for him or against him, right?
Exactly. He imbued a generation with this thirst for heroism, a willingness for martyrdom, this intense political passion.
The sources argue he widened horizons, raised appetites for change. It's telling that the nations that became leaders in this new phase, France, Italy, Poland,
were precisely where the cult of Napoleon was strongest.
These revolutionaries, initially, they wanted more than just independence or constitutional reform. There was this potent, if maybe vague, aspiration for something entirely new. A new people, as one Polish figure put it.
Or combining Christ and Napoleon, according to Mickiewicz. That's quite a mix.
It certainly is. And this brings us to maybe the most detailed and fascinating portrait in the source material from this early period. The Carbonari.
Ah, yes, the charcoal burners.
Presented as the first secret organization to actually pull off a large-scale revolution in modern Europe, the uprising of 1820-21 in Italy.
And their internal world was just steeped in symbolism, ritual, allegory. It's incredible stuff.
The rituals are amazing. They saw themselves as heirs to ancient sects, maybe pre-Christian ones, preserving the unaffected language of nature.
Their meeting place wasn't just a room, it was a symbolic forest, a vendita. A hut.
Apprentices wore a small fragment of wood, symbolizing their raw state, hoping to become charcoal burners, the higher initiates, representing transformation, purity.
The imagery was everywhere. The Grand Master used an axe, not a gavel.
On a wooden block, symbolizing the original tree-trunk, connecting all the branches of the society.
And the ladder, a central symbol, always on the Master's table, representing ascent to perfection and liberty.
The sources even suggest their sign of recognition extending both arms down, clenched fists, might be a distant ancestor of the modern revolutionary clenched fist salute.
Wow. And the fasci, the bundles of sticks.
On the Master's table, symbolizing the members, united in peace.
It's striking how that ancient Roman symbol, the fasces, later appropriated by Mussolini,
Tragically, yes,
was used here for peaceful revolutionary brotherhood.
Their meetings themselves were like ritual purifications by fire in a symbolic grotto or furnace. The great elect, the high-level initiates, had to face ordeals by fire.
Guarded by figures called flames wielding sabers.
Even the architecture was symbolic. Triangular rooms, seating under 3 candles, sun, moon, northern star, guiding their path.
And the opening ritual. 7 solemn axe strokes on the symbolic tree trunk, decorated with flames.
Exclusion was blackballing,
Right.
literally using charcoal and a black book.
And that intense discipline, the burning obligation, absolute secrecy to outsiders, but total disclosure, like a confession, to fellow members.
And for repeat offenders, their names weren't just struck off, they were burned from the rolls in public meetings.
So despite all this elaborate system and their role in the 1820 uprisings in Naples and Piedmont, they ultimately failed militarily.
They did.
Yeah.
But their impact, the sources stress, was profound. They awakened this widespread enthusiasm for a united Italy, gave voice and symbol to that national longing.
And maybe more importantly, they provided the first working model of a large-scale secret revolutionary organization that could mobilize significant numbers.
A model that subsequent groups would absolutely study and adapt.
Their suppression also led to this Carbonari diaspora, members scattered, forming countless smaller, atomized protest groups.
And these groups had incredible names. 5 in a Family, the 7 Sleepers, Sons of Mars, American Hunters Drilling in Pine Woods.
The Black Bellies, the Shirtless Ones, Vampires, Imitators of Sand after Kotzebue's assassin.
even counter-revolutionary groups like the Piercers.
And the source material notes that the brutal reaction, the executions of hundreds of Carbonari leaders after 1820, only intensified this legacy of militants.
It hardened revolutionary resolve. The cost was paid in blood.
This clandestine activity naturally provoked a strong conservative reaction, a backlash across Europe, culminating with the ultra-conservative Charles X in France in 1824.
Masonry, groups like the Carbonari outlawed. Condemned by kings and the Pope, any organized discussion became suspect. Civil liberties curtailed everywhere.
It really seemed like the monarchical order had clamped down successfully.
But as history tends to show, that stability was precarious. Moving into the next phase, say 1830 onwards, the sources show how quickly things were shaken up again.
Underneath the surface of that world restored, the tensions just simmered.
Events like the assassination of the Duc de Berry in 1820, the failed Turin Revolution in 1821, they were tremors. Then came 1830.
The July Revolution in France. Okay, it resulted in Louis-Philippe's juste milieu, that middle ground monarchy, not the radical change many wanted.
But it cracked the facade of the restored Bourbon monarchy.
And what's significant, according to the sources, is how this Paris event immediately triggered upheaval elsewhere. A month later, the spontaneous birth of a new nation, Belgium.
Which in turn inspired that heroic national revolution in Poland against Russia.
These 1830 events provided crucial new hope, not just for nationalists, but for revolutionaries broadly. Change was still possible.
The sources highlight that while nationalist movements were numerically larger then, Italy remained this vital laboratory for revolutionary organization.
After the Carbonari model, Italy, through figures like Mazzini, would devise the prototype of the National Revolutionary Organization.
But before we get to Mazzini, there's this absolutely fascinating and slightly unexpected connection in the sources between Romantic opera and national revolution.
All right, it seems almost unbelievable, but popular culture played a real role here.
It's one of the most striking insights. Rossini, personally quite conservative, created operas like La Gazzaladra, Moses in Egypt, William Tell.
And audiences, especially in occupied Italy, just interpreted them through their own political lens.
Exactly. They identified the opera's patrons, often representing Austrian or Bourbon rulers, with the villains, the tyrants, and the protagonists' struggles for freedom became their own fight.
William Tell, with its resistance themes, must have been incredibly potent after its 1829 Paris premiere.
Absolutely. And then there's Verdi. His operas, even apolitical ones, were actively mobilized by the Risorgimento.
The sources mention Cavour humming the Quella Pura from Il Trovatore before a battle.
And that core message revolutionaries took from Verdi, encapsulated in that line from Attila, "Take the universe, but leave me Italy."
It's such a powerful emotional slogan, straight from popular culture, simplifying complex aims into a potent cry.
And what's remarkable is this musical influence wasn't just national. Social revolutionaries tapped into it too. Buonarroti apparently gave singing lessons.
No way.
Yeah, and his collaborator Angeloni studied musical notation. The Belgian Jacob Katz used the song from Meyerbeer's Robert le Diable.
Even Bakunin, the anarchist.
Even Bakunin. Used the chorus of Assassins from Meyerbeer's Huguenots as a farewell song, and drew on Beethoven's Ode to Joy to rally followers. Music was this shared emotional language.
Beyond opera, the sources highlight creating new revolutionary and national songs. Key tools for mobilization, identity.
After 1830 in France, you get the Parisienne. For the Poles, the Varsovienne becomes this anthem for defeated nationalities.
Belgium gets its Brabançon. Later in Germany, Watch on the Rhine, Deutschland über alles.
These weren't just songs, they were explicit calls to action, shared expressions of identity, defiance.
And speaking of identity, the symbols born then, especially the tricolor flags.
Huge importance. The Belgian flag, supposedly born from ripped curtains after an opera house uprising.
Instantly a national symbol linked to the Brabançon.
The Italian tricolor, green, white, red, often with slogans like equality or death, debuts then. Hungary's red, white, green. Romania's blue, yellow, red, inspiring their anthem in 48.
These were a deliberate contrast to the old imperial symbols, the barbarous escutcheons with eagles and vultures.
Aiming for colors seen as pure as the people.
But it wasn't just tricolors. The sources note a key moment in 1832. Lafayette, symbol of moderate revolution who'd given Louis-Philippe the French tricolor.
Was reportedly shocked to see the rival red flag appear on a comrade's coffin during demonstrations.
The red flag gaining traction.
As a distinct symbol of proletarian protest, social revolution. setting itself against the tricolor, which remained associated with national or liberal aims.
Social revolutionaries sometimes tried to integrate it, maybe a red stripe in the middle of the tricolor.
They did, but the sources suggest the tricolor generally remained the rainbow of the free for many, even those seeking social change.
This era also marks a significant split within the broader revolutionary tradition. Nationalism was initially tied to liberal constitutionalism up to 1830.
But the nationalist ideal of fraternite, brotherhood, unity began to pull away from the liberals' core value of liberté, individual rights.
Especially in Central and Eastern Europe.
Exactly. Constitutional liberalism started to look like a distinct alternative path. Evolution over revolution, sometimes prioritizing ideology or even violence over just constitutional aims.
And this leads right into a crucial development in the 1840s, the definitive rise of social revolution as a rival force.
The new generation, maybe disillusioned, turned squarely to socialist ideals. They revived the banner of eagle-eyed equality,
Explicitly positioning it as a rival to the Fraternite of the National Revolutionaries.
the sources state clearly. This marks the start of a long, often bitter struggle between these two main branches, national liberation and rights versus fundamental social and economic equality.
Even though nationalism remained powerful, dominating 1848, Paris kept its place as the central hub, the Mecca of the faith.
Right, and even after the 48 defeats, the last Parisian Revolution, the bloody Paris Commune of 1871,
Became a foundational legend, a model specifically for those emerging social revolutionary movements.
Now, to really understand the ideas driving these movements, we need to look at the key theorists and organizers highlighted in the sources.
And that really starts with Filippo Buonarroti, a survivor of the Babeuf conspiracy from the 1790s. His influence decades later was huge.
His book, The Conspiracy for Equality, published 1828, a low point for revolutionary hopes, is absolutely crucial.
The sources call it the starting point for a distinct, continuous social revolutionary tradition, a memorial to Babeuf, publicizing his forgotten ideas, providing an ancestry, a model.
It was seen by later revolutionaries as an Archimedean lever, a point to move the world from.
And his analysis of past failures was stark. They fail, he thought, because they lacked strong, prepared leaders ready to institute a revolutionary government of sages.
His proposal was for a provisional authority that would not initially be elected.
That's quite a departure from liberal ideals.
Definitely. Its job was solely to direct all the force of the nation against enemies, establish institutions to imperceptibly lead people towards sovereignty.
And only then prepare the final constitution.
He trusted a strong, constant, enlightened, immovable will to guide things, aiming for a Rousseauian return to a natural state where the general will prevails.
And his influence wasn't just theoretical, he was active in Brussels, a haven for exiles. During the 1830 Belgian Revolt, he directly advised figures like Rogier and Potter,
Urging them, delay elections, be dictators if necessary. He saw Belgium as the chance for the great example France failed to provide.
He also planned a reorganized Carbonari forest and mountain grades. Babeufist terms like phalanx, rigorous security.
Even after his grand organization dissolved, living in Paris, he became this venerated, almost legendary figure, influencing young radicals, artists.
Like Philippe Goucheron, who painted his portrait and echoed his call for equality.
Buonarroti insisted on a sévérité de l'esprit exclusif intolerance for principle's sake. Separate revolutionary principles from personal quarrels. Pure love of equality was the guide.
And he warned against would-be scholars, seeing them as the aristocracy incarnate, suspecting intellectual arrogance could betray the cause.
Moving on, Giuseppe Mazzini emerges as the key figure for the National Revolutionary Organization prototype.
A Carbonari veteran himself, imprisoned in 1830, he saw his mission as an apostolate providing martyrs, teachings for a new nationalist society.
In exile, 1831, he founded Young Italy, became the model for similar groups across Europe.
And his significance lies partly in his decisive break with Buonarroti.
Right, he rejected what he saw as the spirit of caste in Buonarroti's secretive dictatorial approach, rejected French leadership, small group dictatorship, terror, one-man rule, argued an Italian movement couldn't succeed on those principles.
He then expanded this, creating the Mazzinian International, the first real attempt to unite revolutionary nationalists internationally against the monarchies.
Figures like Garibaldi took this cause, national liberation and republicanism, even to Latin America.
And despite the failures of 48, Mazzini remained central, the heart and soul of Romantic nationalism for decades.
Now, the repression and failures of the 30s and 40s, like the suppressed 1839 Paris insurrection, They had a predictable effect.
Drove activity back underground, secret societies again.
And strikingly, prisons became important recruitment centers, often led by figures like Louis Auguste Blanqui.
Ah, Blanqui. Credited with developing the organizations where the modern social revolutionary tradition really took organizational shape. The Society of the Families, Society of the Seasons.
These had that cellular structure. Small units, 5 members, families, linked up into sections, quarters, a central committee, trusted agents, rigorous 3-man screening jury.
Their internal catechism emphasized equality as the principal basis of society, explicitly opposed egoism ruled by new aristocrats of force and money.
Echoing some of Buonarroti's critiques of elites.
This disciplined, hierarchical, conspiratorial model, focused on seizing power through a determined minority, became known as Blanquism, a lasting impact on revolutionary theory and practice.
The sources then turn to German émigrés, highlighting their unique path. Unlike Poles or Italians, with strong nationalist émigré subcultures.
German émigrés often moved from national to more explicitly social perspectives, influenced by philosophy, the fragmented political situation back home.
Early German nationalism existed among émigrés' German People's Union, Young Germany affiliated with Mazzini.
But among German workers in exile, Paris, later London, there was this strong thread of religiosity.
Highly receptive to figures like Lemai's, preaching a social Christianity against exploitation, seeing the people as a suffering servant with a messianic destiny.
Karl Schapper, leader of the League of the Just, addressed followers as brothers in Christ, saw social revolution as a great resurrection day.
But deeply suspicious of intellectuals, the aristocracy of the mind, who thought book learning entitled them to rule.
This mix of anti-intellectualism and religious socialism was popularized by figures like the tailor Wilhelm Weitling.
The sources call him a social Luther. He wrote the League of the Just's main manifesto, Humanity as it is and as it ought to be, surprisingly wide distribution.
Weitling diagnosed money itself as the disease carrier, proposed a radical utopia blending natural law, Christian charity,
Abolish property, inheritance, value work by hours, governed by an order of families, order of production.
The suppression after the 1839 Paris insurrection pushed many German émigrés towards more revolutionary paths. Many moved to London.
Formed the Educational Society for German Working Men, keeping the League of the Just alive. This group expanded, added foreign members, cooperated with other exiles.
Groups like the Democratic Friends of All Nations, later the International Democratic Association.
These international groups in London explicitly emphasize abolishing property, achieving real freedom of man beyond just national freedom.
The sources even note activity in America, a German commune of Young America, leading reforms in New York, laying groundwork for broader internationalism.
And this internationalist, social revolutionary milieu in London, this is where Karl Marx enters the picture, as the sources detail.
Presented not just as a theorist, but the figure providing a crucial ideological armory, a strategic framework for a significant wing of the social revolutionary camp.
His early philosophical critiques were pivotal. His critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, the 1844 introduction where he first used proletariat and communist as liberation labels.
Applying his transformative method, reversing Hegel, material conditions shape consciousness and history, not the other way around. Applied this to politics.
Marx linked communism not just to universal suffrage, but to abolishing the existing state. True universality achieved not through the state, but by destroying it.
His famous formulation, just as philosophy finds its material weapons in the proletariat, so the proletariat finds its intellectual weapons in philosophy.
Philosophy is the head, and the proletariat is its heart.
The ultimate goal, in Hegelian terms. Realizing philosophy by abolishing the proletariat's conditions, liberating the proletariat by realizing philosophy's critical potential.
Engels is quoted saying communism makes religion superfluous, abolishes it using Aufheben, abolish, preserve, elevate.
The sources note in an intellectual, maybe condescending tone here, a disconnect from religiously inclined workers like Weitling.
Potentially, yes. Then the formation of the Communist League in 1847, successor to the League of the Just, stated purpose: abolish property, the bourgeois class.
Marx and Engels commissioned to write a statement, the Communist Manifesto.
But the sources add a vital point. The Communist Party Marx spoke for existed then largely in his prophetic imagination. A small group of displaced intellectuals, no mass base yet.
After the 1848 failures, Marx focused on two key factors for future success: the unique historical destiny of the proletariat as the revolutionary agent.
And the necessity of dictatorship.
He introduced the destiny idea just before 48, asserted the need for temporary dictatorship right after.
His later concept, dictatorship of the proletariat, as the necessary transition to a classless society, is explicitly linked by the sources to Blanqui's idea of a determined minority seizing power.
Maintaining a state of permanent revolution to dismantle the old order. The sources even say Marx's language became derivative of Blanquist terms, linking the revolutionary proletariat with the party of Blanqui.
This focus on scientific theory, the proletariat's role, the authoritarian phase, brought Marx into significant conflict with others, notably Pierre-Joseph Proudhon.
A clash starting around 1844, described not just as ideas battling, but a fundamental conflict. Moralistic versus authoritarian temperaments over whether revolutionaries need a rigid ideology.
Marx insisted yes. Proudhon vehemently no, leading him towards anarchism.
Interesting they agreed on some things, though. Both saw earlier socialisms as utopian reveries fantastiques, fantastic daydreams.
Both rejected bourgeois liberalism. Both opposed nationalism, despite their own backgrounds. Both products of that new journalism, the shift from abstract philosophy to direct polemics.
But the differences were fundamental. Proudhon, deeply shaped by Christian teachings, religious symbols, influenced by the Bible alongside Smith and Hegel.
Marx, materialistic, atheistic, grounded in economics and philosophy.
And their use of the labor theory of value highlights this. Marx used Ricardo's idea as a scientific tool to analyze present exploitation surplus value.
Proudhon used it as a moral imperative for future equality. Saw the pay gap not as scientific exploitation, but a simple error in counting, a moral injustice.
Scientific law versus moral principle, reflecting their core temperaments, different visions for revolution.
Now let's step back from the theorists. How did these ideas actually spread, engage society? The sources really underline the increasing importance of revolutionary journalism and media.
Even early conspirators understood print. Bazin's Lèche philosophique may be a potential organ for secret Philadelphians.
And printers themselves, a vital role. Compositors, printers forming radical circles, especially among German immigrants in Paris.
A German action society, after the failed 39 insurrection, shifted focus entirely to printing and propaganda as its main revolutionary activity.
Brussels is highlighted as a hub. Legal revolutionary journalism, new tech like rail and telegraph. The Belgian theorist Napoleon Barthel reportedly argued these heralded a scientific religion of humanity spread instantly by telegraph.
The Saint-Simonians, radical reformers, if not strictly revolutionaries, were pioneers in using media for mass outreach.
Figures like Pierre Leroux transformed journals like The Globe into organs of apostolate, distributing widely, saw publication as a mission for social transformation.
Leroux was also key in popularizing terms like socialism, individualism, a kind of lexicographer for the left.
And we see journals written and edited by workers. Le Journal des Ouvriers, L'Atelier.
An interesting dynamic here. Often suspicious of intellectual theorists despite using revolutionary language.
After 48, influenced by Proudhon, many worker journals were more revolutionary than socialist, emphasizing direct action, mutual aid over state-led reform or dogma.
Then, the penny press revolution, starting around 1836. Girardin, Dutoc in France. Drastically reduced price, massively increased circulation.
Focus shifted from political polemics to publicity of facts, not polemic of ideas.
Right.
Using sensationalism, canards, popularizing romans feuilletons, serialized novels to grab readers.
This also led towards visual effects, journalism made flesh. The French Revolution used visual iconography. Napoleon blended royal theater with revolutionary symbols.
But under Louis-Philippe, the most enduring political images weren't for the king, but powerful cartoons against him.
Enter Daumier, his political and social satire using crayon lithography, inexpensive, wide reproduction.
His relentless cartoons targeting Louis-Philippe's Gargantua, the legislative paunch, created an indelible negative picture.
The sources argue these images influenced class consciousness more effectively than any lengthy socialist pamphlet. Visual satire stuck.
Journalism also engaged ears. La Ruche Populaire used folk songs. The German press had an incantational style. Fallen's Free Voices of Fresh Youth used songs of heroism for agitation, even inspiring assassination.
The depth of commitment is captured in that quote. A journalist viewing editing as a daily sacrament, linking ideological dedication to newspaper production.
This ideological journalism became increasingly linked to revolutionary organization in the 1850s. Julian Harney in England connecting the radical press to the Chartists, political associations.
In authoritarian contexts like Russia, Thick journals, literary magazines with commentary and literary criticism, became a substitute for open political opposition. Belinsky, Chernyshevsky, Pisarev used it as a veiled critique.
And Marx himself, deeply involved, editor of Rheinische Zeitung, saw the German press having an exalted pedagogic function, needing to create party spirit where association was weak.
What's particularly insightful? Counter-revolutionaries were just as quick, sometimes quicker, to adopt these techniques.
Michael Katkov's Moscow News launched a cruel crusade against Poland after '63, using anti-foreign sentiment, feuilletons, to create effective anti-revolutionary mass journalism, defined his paper as exclusively Russian.
Journalism also covered overseas adventures under Napoleon III. His critics coined the term imperialism.
Figures like Henri Rochefort used journals like La Lanterne, huge appeal, satirical edge, tried to rally European socialists.
Ironically, prompting rivals like Girardin to boost circulation by focusing on telegraphic dispatches, stock markets, sports, le monde sportique.
So, it's abundantly clear, media in this era wasn't passive. It was an active tool, a battleground shaping the political landscape and consciousness.
Given all this ferment across Europe, the sources raise a fascinating question. Why did some countries, Switzerland, England, America, seem relatively immune compared to France? Immune to these new, often conspiratorial or rigid revolutionary organizations?
The sources explicitly contrast France, which, despite successful revolutions, kept breeding new ideas and groups with these others. Let's take Switzerland first. James Fasey in Geneva is a key example of a progressive but evolutionary alternative.
Fasey had a cosmopolitan background, early revolutionary activity, used journalism against political indifference in Geneva.
But he sharply broke with Bonarosians, later communists, especially when they tried turning young Europe towards social revolution. He opposed restrictions on freedom, growth, saw socialist communists as creating mummies, lifeless societies, by hindering dynamic processes.
Instead, he believed in bourgeois commerce, increased money circulation in a free society as the solution to social problems, ending bondage without total overhaul.
He focused on concrete constitutional reforms in Geneva, democratizing institutions, converting forts to social use, influenced the Swiss Federal Republic's liberal, decentralized structure.
The sources note Fasey, like many who might have been revolutionaries elsewhere, was effectively absorbed into the Swiss political system. He changed it, pushed it progressively, but was also changed by it, working within its framework.
This absorption, channeling reformist energy into incremental change, was a kind of immunity to that rigid, professionalized revolutionary tradition on the continent.
America is presented similarly. Land of successful past revolution, welcomed defeated European revolutionaries like Kosciuszko, Bonneville.
But contributed little back to Europe in new revolutionary leadership, ideology, or organization during this time.
The sources argue America realized Enlightenment ideas through evolution and expansion within its established framework.
It had intense political passions, party spirit, but these became defined more by material interests, reformist electoral activity often disdained by European social revolutionaries, rather than shared spiritual or ideological ideas.
America accommodated utopian experiments, but wasn't a source of revolutionary feedback to Europe like France was.
The core insight, contrasting France with these others, simply having had a revolution or some popular representation wasn't enough. The difference was a type of development.
Evolutionary realization within flexible systems, Switzerland, US, England, provided an outlet.
On the more authoritarian, fragmented continent where ideology often became a surrogate for religion or participation, the theoretical development and organizational refinement of revolutionary concepts for total upheaval persisted, evolved into a professionalized tradition.
Finally, let's look at the internal conflicts and the waning of some hopes, especially after the 1848 failures.
The counter-revolutionary resurgence benefited significantly, not just from tactical inexperience, but crucially from underlying ideological conflicts between revolutionary factions.
In 1848, German liberals seeking constitutional change were unnerved by the rise of the workers' movement, the specter of communism, from figures like Marx.
This fear pushed many liberals towards conservatism, prioritizing order over more revolution.
Even more fundamental, the conflict between national unification and constitutional republicanism, especially in Italy, Germany. Nationalism often proved a more potent mass mobilizing force.
The Paris Commune of 1871, though crushed, stands out as a crucial legend and model, specifically for the social revolutionary tradition.
A brief, intense attempt at fundamental transformation, reviving radical dreams from 1792-94.
But sources also note the significant internal divisions. Proudhonists versus Blanquists, decentralized associations versus centralized authority.
Despite heroism, like the Pole Dabrowski dying in its defense, the Commune's defeat after France's humiliation by Prussia powerfully symbolized ideas crushed by state power, military force.
And that sense of crushed dreams wasn't just social revolution. The dream of heroic national revolution also waned significantly later.
Italy unified mainly by war and diplomacy, cavour, not mass revolution. Poland's hopes definitively crushed by Russia after the 1863 uprising.
The sources state the Italo-Polish era of heroic violence had ended.
This period after the 1860s saw the triumph of conservative governmental nationalism, unifying Germany under Bismarck, consolidating Italy, strengthening the nation-state elsewhere.
The revolutionary appeal of nationalism was undercut by its successful implementation from above. The period became dominated less by romantic heroes, more by the more prosaic social revolutionaries of the internationals.
And in this context of consolidating, expanding European powers, imperialism emerged as the last great ism of the era to find a name. Initially used by critics of Napoleon III.
Even within the social revolutionary movement, conflicts intensified after 48. The major clash, Marx versus Bakunin in the First International.
Marx, with Blanquist's support, pushed for a disciplined political party to conquer state power.
Bakunin, the passionate anarchist, fundamentally opposed all authority, the state itself.
Marx got Bakunin expelled in 1872. But the sources point out many national sections rallied to Bakunin's banner, demonstrating that deep, unresolved tension, authoritarian versus anti-authoritarian visions.
And the theme of violence runs through it all. Figures like Gustave Cluseret openly advocating violent means, not just for political change, but fundamental social transformation.
To replace the social axis of capital, handed over to labor. Violence often seen as a necessary midwife for a new society, national or social.
So what can we take away from this incredible deep dive into the mid-19th century? We've journeyed from those secret conspiracies and symbolic forests after Napoleon.
Seen how revolutionary hopes caught the wind of nationalism, used surprising tools like opera, journalism, watched different isms, liberalism, nationalism, socialism, communism develop, clash, transform.
We've explored why some places seemed immune, while others became breeding grounds, laboratories.
We've witnessed that constant, often painful tension between national identity and universalist dreams, and the fundamental conflict between political reform national unity versus fundamental social economic change.
These weren't just abstract debates. They were fault lines defining the period, shaping the complex landscape of modern political ideologies.
And this history isn't just dusty archives. It matters profoundly. These are the crucible moments where concepts we still grapple with, nation, class, equality, political action, were born and first defined.
Our understanding is deeply rooted in these 19th century struggles.
And the sources highlight how adaptive these ideas were, finding unexpected homes in opera, journalism, secret conspiracies, even absorption across the Atlantic.
And how the internal struggles between isms shaped the terrain that followed, influencing alliances, splits, strategies for generations.
Given all that, how revolutionary energy manifested in unexpected places, how ideology clashes were both driving force and vulnerability, it leaves us with a thought.
What surprising places or forms might revolutionary or even counter-revolutionary energy be taking today? Perhaps hidden in plain sight, like the Carbonari in their forests or Daumier's cartoons, subtly shaping a nation's consciousness.
It does make you pause, doesn't it?
Thinking about how ideologies find leverage in new technologies, cultural spaces, suggests we might need to look beyond the obvious political arenas today.
Something to keep an eye on.
Indeed.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really digging into something fascinating, the intricate history of revolutionary traditions across Europe and America.
Yeah, we've got some great source material here. Excerpts from a book that honestly gives this incredibly sweeping view, tracing how these movements bubbled up and changed, from the late 1700s all the way into the early 20th century.
Exactly. And this deep dive, it's not just about listing dates and names. What's compelling about this text, I think, is how it helps us connect the dots. You see these ideas about power, about change, just jumping across borders, morphing, sometimes colliding in really dramatic ways.
Right. It's trying to get at that underlying current, that fire in the minds of men, as the saying goes. And as the source makes really clear, and as we'll explore, very much women too, what drove people to challenge everything, to try and completely remake their societies.
That's the core of it. So our mission here is to unpack all that richness for you. We want to pull out the most striking insights, get a handle on the why behind it all. We'll be looking at how the idea of revolutionary power itself shifted, the roles different groups played, sometimes hidden roles, how things like, communications spread these ideas, and those constant arguments, the tensions between different ways of thinking about revolution, all seen through this specific source material.
Think of it as mapping the currents, the forces that shaped, well, over a century of pretty radical thinking and action. How did they tick? How did they organize? What were the big dreams, the big visions pulling them forward? This source gives us a really unique lens.
Okay, let's dive right in. The source starts with something pretty fundamental, a really big shift it identifies right at the outset. It's about the changing nature of revolutionary power.
Yeah, this is a really striking point early on. The argument is basically that how people thought about revolutionary power, and therefore how they tried to get it, changed dramatically. It moved away from being seen as primarily moral or maybe charismatic.
Okay, moral or charismatic, like based on the rightness of the cause, or a leader's personal magnetism.
Exactly. The source uses this almost poetic language describing that older view as cool, elegant, and static. Think inspiring figures, grand ideals, but it argues this shifted towards something it calls thermodynamic.
Thermodynamic.
Yeah, meaning hot, hard, and movable.
Huh. Hot, hard, and movable. That sounds, well, it sounds a lot more forceful. Less about inspiration, more about, I don't know, raw energy, applied force.
Precisely. The source suggests that the old belief in, say, the absolute moral rightness of your cause, or the sheer force of will of one heroic individual, think about Napoleon, maybe the last great embodiment of that singular, almost mystical authority, the kind of romantic idea started to fade. Especially after the last Napoleon, there just wasn't another figure who could command that same kind of belief based purely on personality or the perceived justice of their cause.
So if that heroic individual, that sort of moral authority, wasn't the driving engine anymore, what filled the gap? What became the new source of power in these revolutionary ideas?
Well, the source argues pretty compellingly that in the later 19th century, power became increasingly identified with, and this is a great phrase, the essential elements of the heat engine itself.
The heat engine, like actual steam engine.
Kind of, yeah. Metaphorically, at least. It means mechanical organization and violence became central. It wasn't just that revolutionaries used machines or violence sometimes. It was deeper. The machine itself, its efficiency, its predictability, its ability to apply force systematically became a model for how to organize violence and exert power.
Wow. The machine as a model for revolution,
Yeah.
that's a really powerful way to frame it. It explains so much about why certain methods started to seem more effective, right?
Exactly. If you start thinking of power as something mechanical, something that requires generating and applying force, then your strategies inevitably shift. You move away from relying just on stirring speeches or moral appeals.
And you focus instead on building, well, efficient, maybe even ruthless organizations. Machine-like structures designed to apply pressure or violence systematically.
That's the core of the shift the source describes. It's like a move from power being seen as inherent in a person or a structure to power being something you actively generate and apply through organized force and maybe standardized processes, like a machine delivering energy.
That distinction, moral heroism versus mechanical force or thermodynamic power, it feels really significant. As you were reading this, how did you see that playing out? Does that idea resonate beyond just these 19th century revolutionaries? Can we see echoes of that today?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, think about the development of modern warfare, obviously, but also the rise of mass political parties built on really rigorous internal discipline, coordinated action. Think about industrial production, large-scale logistics. There's this persistent focus on efficiency, on standardization, on the ability to generate and apply force or influence on a massive organized scale.
Almost independent of individual personalities sometimes.
Right. And today, you could argue that the power wielded by huge, highly organized institutions, or even some forms of online mobilization where the impact comes from sheer scale and coordinated effort, rather than just individual charisma. You could see that as a kind of modern thermodynamic power.
Yeah.
It definitely offers a lens for thinking about how change is attempted, revolutionary or otherwise.
That's a fascinating connection. Makes this historical concept feel very immediate. Okay, so moving from the abstract nature of power, the source also digs deep into the people, the specific social groups that often became the breeding grounds, the crucibles for these revolutionary ideas. And one group gets a lot of focus, especially in Russia, the intelligentsia and the student subcultures.
Yes, the Russian experience gets particular attention here. and it seems quite unique in its intensity. The term intelligentsia itself is key. Apparently, it really took off in Russia around 1861, right after the serfs were emancipated.
Okay.
And the source calls it a verbal talisman for this new generation of students who were coming from more diverse social backgrounds than before. It meant something much bigger, more universal in Russia than it had in Poland, where the term originated.
Verbal talisman, that suggests it was more than just a label. It had some kind of symbolic weight.
Definitely. Different groups sort of projected their hopes onto it. Liberals, the Slavophiles who idealized Russian tradition, the Westernizers looking towards Europe, and revolutionaries, they all seem to see the intelligentsia as holding the key to a national awakening, a force for mental mobilization against the old czarist bureaucracy.
So it was this flexible, powerful idea, but the source really emphasizes the environment where these ideas didn't just float around, but actively fermented. The universities, the elite schools.
Right. These places weren't just for learning calculus or classics. They were intense social and political melting pots. You had prestigious places like the Alexandrovsky Lyceum. The University of St. Petersburg apparently saw its student numbers explode, and technical schools too, like the Medical Surgical Academy, the Technological Institute.
And the source points out this fascinating paradox. These schools were meant to train people for the imperial state to create loyal civil servants.
Yet they became, and this is another great phrase from the source, a crucible for the tempering of radical revolt.
A crucible, yeah, that captures it. You have these students, often not from the aristocracy, cut off from their old lives, suddenly immersed in the capital, exposed to radical European ideas. The source mentions they developed this mix of elitist attitudes and egalitarian habits.
Exactly. And they lived this incredibly intense communal life. It wasn't just classes. They had shared libraries. They set up mutual aid funds to help each other out financially. They produced their own illegal publications, lithographed, to bypass the censors. And they even had informal student courts.
Student courts, wow.
Yeah, to sort of regulate behavior and force their own norms. This incredibly dense, interconnected world was just perfect for fostering that mix of intense intellectual debate, political passion, and a strong sense of shared moral purpose. It could easily tip over into radicalism.
You can absolutely see how that environment would be fertile ground, and the source links this directly to things like the movement to the people.
It does. That whole phenomenon of students trying to go to the people, this sort of compulsive ethnographic search for a more authentic life among the peasantry, the source sees that as growing directly out of this student radicalism. They idealized the peasant commune, the mir, saw it as this repository of a better, more communal way of life.
And they desperately wanted to bridge that gap between their intellectual world and what they saw as the reality of the common people.
Right. And the source notes this wasn't just politics. It seeped into culture, too. You had artists, the wanderers, musicians like the Mighty Handful, all focusing on depicting the lives of simple people. It reflected this deep cultural yearning that came out of those student circles.
There was a whole cultural moment. And then the source zooms in on one specific, really interesting group that emerged from this. The Tchaikovsky Circle.
Ah, yes, the Tchaikovsky Circle, named after Nicholas Tchaikovsky, formed by medical students around 1869. They're presented as fascinating because they consciously set themselves up in opposition to the kind of ruthless ends justify means approach of earlier figures like Sergei Nechayev.
Nechayev was the really extreme one, right? Advocating total manipulation and violence.
Exactly. So the Tchaikovskyists emphasized intense moralism, ethical purity. They wanted a revolution based on high principles.
But here's that twist the source highlights, and it's kind of chilling. They're very focused on moral purity, on internal group righteousness, somehow gave birth to rituals and practices that ended up heightening fanaticism.
Yes, that's the paradox. The source describes their meetings as this weird mix of, like, group therapy and revolutionary strategy sessions. They put a huge emphasis on objective analysis, not just of society, but of each other, of personal morality, individual character flaws, everything.
And this led to that practice, the criticism of each by all.
Precisely. Members would publicly, meticulously dissect each other's characters and actions in group meetings. They saw it as the exact method for the regulation of relations between individuals and society.
Wow. And the source actually suggests that specific practice might be an early route, a kind of precursor to later Leninist practices like self-criticism.
It draws that unsettling potential connection. It shows how group dynamics, even when framed in terms of honesty and moral improvement, could inadvertently create patterns that later get used for much more coercive forms of ideological control and conformity.
And this group, the Tchaikovsky Circle, with their unique blend of moral fervor, intellectualism, and intense group dynamics, they became quite influential, didn't they? Spreading their ideas through manifestos and setting up these circles of self-education and practical activity.
Yeah, they became a kind of model, radiating outwards, influencing how other revolutionary cells structured themselves, combining study, moral commitment, and practical organizing.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What is it about students and intellectuals that so often puts them at the center of these movements? And that intense focus on collective moral critique, does it ultimately purify a movement, or does it embed something potentially dangerous within it?
Well, intellectuals often have the tools, the language, to articulate grievances and dream up alternatives. Students are often energetic, less tied down, living closely together. Those campuses become pressure cookers. As for the critique, the source implies it's a double-edged sword. It can foster unity and honesty, sure, but it can also create immense pressure to conform, making it easier to exclude or even purge dissenters later on. It definitely shapes the movement's internal culture in profound ways.
Absolutely. Okay, let's shift focus a bit. Another key element the source really digs into is the role of utopian visions, how dreams of a perfect future fueled revolutionary action.
Right. The source traces how these secular utopias evolved. You had early ones, maybe from Foigny or Verastallet, depicting these purely imaginary ideal societies, some pretty radical for their time, imagining overcoming divisions like sex or class.
But then the focus started to shift, didn't it? Away from pure fantasy towards idealizing real or semi-real places.
Exactly. Like the Jesuit state in Paraguay, or
Yeah.
romanticizing unspoiled Indians. But the really critical shift the source emphasizes is the move from what it calls escapist utopias to heroic utopias.
Escapist versus heroic. What's the difference there?
Escapist utopias are maybe more about finding solace, dreaming of a better place, potentially making people passive, lulling them into quiet acceptance. Heroic utopias, on the other hand, are distinctly future-oriented, secular visions designed explicitly to inspire action, to create militant optimism. The source brings in Ernst Bloch's distinction here, Uchronias looking back, versus utopias pushing forward towards secular revelation.
So utopia became less a destination for dreaming and more a blueprint for fighting, a future state to actively build.
That's the idea, though the source does acknowledge it's not always clear-cut. Sometimes utopian thinking can lead to reformism because the post-future seems so far off, maybe compromise is better, but the main thrust here is on these heroic utopias as vital fuel for radical movements.
And this wasn't just dry theory, right? The source makes it clear these utopian visions spread through popular culture, through literature, art.
Absolutely. You see these utopian fantasies popping up in novels across different countries. Works like Paris, en l'an 2000, or that incredibly influential American novel, Edward Bellamy's More. Looking backward, imagining a socialist Boston in 2000. Soviet examples, German communist literature. It was an international trend.
And there was that interesting phenomenon in the 1840s, literary populism, glorifying existing worker and peasant art forms.
Yeah, that ties back to the intelligentsia idealizing the common folk. But here it's about art. The source quotes this belief that the creative role in poetry belongs to the proletariat, to the people. It wasn't just about depicting utopia, it was finding utopian potential in existing popular culture.
George Sand gets a specific mention here for using the serialized novel.
Right, using that incredibly popular format for what the source calls seductive socialist propaganda. Novels like Spirit weren't just stories, they were challenging norms, pushing socialist ideas to a mass audience.
And art wasn't just depicting things. It was used to actively fortify the message. Like Arnold Rouge trying to use his Spartacus opera, using the magic of music to stir revolutionary feelings.
It shows this understanding that revolution isn't just intellectual. You have to mobilize emotions, tap into deeper desires. Art, literature, music, they could make the utopian vision feel real, feel attainable, stir the soul in a way the political tracks alone couldn't.
So how exactly does the source suggest these visions, these maybe even myths, drive real action? And how effective were things like novels or operas as revolutionary tools?
The source suggests they provide that essential North Star, a compelling alternative to the present. They offer hope, a shared goal, something that makes the current reality seem unbearable by contrast. And art and literature, they make these visions vivid, emotional, relatable. They bypass pure logic, tap into feelings, build that collective identity and commitment needed to actually do something. The source presents them as really vital tools for spreading ideas and building that emotional fire.
Okay. From motivating ideas to secret action. The source spends a lot of time on the hidden world of secret societies and conspiracy.
Yeah, this is where we get into the underground networks. The source talks about historical links between established groups like the Masons or the Illuminati and the newer revolutionary groups. It mentions Mexico as a striking example. Rival revolutionary factions actually named after Masonic rites, the Escacises and the Orquinos.
Though there's some debate about how direct that influence really was.
True, the source acknowledges that. Some historians downplay it, others point to clear links in symbolism or how revolutionary festivals were organized. But the influence of the Bavarian Illuminati, founded by Adam Weishaupt, gets special attention.
Their core idea was achieving equality through secrecy.
Yes, and through a specific hierarchical structure. The source mentions their triangular system. A leader would initiate or breathe their ideas into two people below, who'd each do the same to two more, and so on. Theoretically, you could mobilize thousands from the top down, secretly. The triangle itself, a potent religious symbol repurposed.
That's a classic cell structure, isn't it? Very effective for clandestine work, and these ideas spread.
Filtered into France through figures like Bonneville. And this connects to that core idea, the secret of masonry, as the source puts it, destroy and rebuild. Distruggere et refabricar. The source even suggests a possible link to Proudhon, the anarchist thinker, who was apparently a Mason. It captures that total vision. Tear everything down, build something new.
So these societies offered networks, organizational models, and powerful, sometimes mystical symbols. The source then talks about groups like the Carbonari in Italy.
The Carbonari, the charcoal burners, were a big network,
Yeah.
linked to figures like Lafayette, and importantly, Filippo Buonarroti, a veteran revolutionary. Buonarroti's concept of a revolutionary phalanx is really key here.
A phalanx, like the ancient Greek military formation.
Metaphorically, he envisioned this core group, maybe 2,000 followers, utterly dedicated, ideologically pure. And the source emphasizes Buonarroti's passion for purity and for purge.
Purity and purge, that sounds ominous.
It is. The source explicitly links this idea, coming from Buonarroti's idealization of Babeuf's earlier conspiracy, directly to the mindset of the modern professional revolutionary. That relentless need for ideological conformity within the vanguard, and the willingness, even the perceived necessity, to purge anyone who deviates.
So a direct line from these early conspiracies to later practices of internal cleansing within revolutionary parties. Chilling. Now here's where the source presents something truly bizarre, almost paradoxical. This idea of an inevitable symbiosis between the revolutionaries and the police hunting them.
Yeah, this isn't just about informants. The source argues this symbiosis got incredibly intense, almost defining, in Russia. Why? Because the Tsarist police state, especially the third section, was so pervasive, so intrusive.
Okay, but symbiosis implies a mutual relationship. How could the police possibly help the revolutionaries?
Well, the source gives this absolutely stunning example, the 1905 revolution. One of the major triggers for it was a massive demonstration led by a priest, Father Gapon.
Right, Bloody Sunday.
Exactly. But here's the twist. Gapon's labor organization, the Assembly of Factory and Mill Workers, was initially set up with the knowledge and support of the police. It was part of the Zubatov movement, a police strategy to create state-controlled unions to manage worker discontent.
Wait, the police helped create the group that sparked the 1905 revolution? That's unbelievable.
It's deeply counterintuitive. The source explains that Gapon's group, while police-backed, developed its own secret radical agenda. And on Bloody Sunday, it was this group that led that huge, peaceful march of 150,000 workers to the Winter Palace, which ended in the massacre that lit the fuse for revolution across Russia.
That is an incredible example of unintended consequences.
And it gets wilder. The source points out that elements spun off from this police-created Zubatov movement actually played a direct role in later revolutionary innovations in 1905, like forming the very first Soviet of Workers in Ivanovo-Voznezhensk and helping organize the massive general strike in October.
So the state's attempt to control dissent actually ended up seeding revolutionary structures and actions.
It's a stark illustration of how state control can backfire spectacularly. The source emphasizes that in this intense cat-and-mouse game in Russia, the lines just blurred completely. Revolutionaries and police were constantly infiltrating, studying, manipulating each other. Sometimes, apparently, it was impossible to know who someone really worked for.
It paints this really murky picture where the hunter and hunted are locked in this strange dance that shapes both of them. So, based on the source, what does this tell us about secret organizations and this weird symbiosis? How does it shape movements?
Well, secrecy is obviously necessary under repression, but the source suggests it breeds paranoia, prioritizes discipline over broader appeal, and can lead to those purges we talked about. The symbiosis, especially in Russia, shows power isn't just open conflict, it's this complex game of infiltration, manipulation, unintended results. The state's own actions can end up empowering or molding the opposition in ways they never intended, blurring the lines and fundamentally affecting the character of the resolution that emerges.
Okay, let's shift now to the big ideological battles the source covers. A major one is the clash between Proudhon and Marx.
Right, Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, hugely influential, especially outside of Germany. The source notes that even Marx, early on in the Holy Family, actually praised Proudhon quite highly compared to some German thinkers he was attacking.
High praise indeed from Marx.
Yeah, Marx apparently said Proudhon writes not simply in the interest of the proletariat, he is himself a proletarian worker. Proudhon, famous for property as theft, wanted to figure out future society by studying property's effects empirically, not just through abstract philosophy. Marx initially seemed to respect that approach.
But they fell out spectacularly later. Marx wrote that scathing critique, The Poverty of Philosophy.
Big time. The source hints at the deep theoretical and practical divides that opened up. It also subtly suggests Marx himself later sort of accommodated the reality of German social democracy, contrasting that maybe with Lenin's more Blanquist, conspiratorial leanings later on. Proudhon's influence, though, spread far, Spain, Portugal, Mexico, showing his reach.
The source then tracks the rise of social democracy, particularly the German model, as this major force.
Yeah, based on Marxist ideas but adapted, it spread across Europe. Think Plekhanov bringing it to Russia. The Second International, founded in 1889, really solidified it. But the source makes a critical point. German social democracy, despite its strength, arguably became less democratic internally by fiercely rejecting Edward Bernstein's revisionism.
Bernstein was the one challenging the core Marxist predictions, right, saying capitalism wasn't collapsing.
Exactly. In Evolutionary Socialism, he looked around late 19th century Europe and said, look, Marx's predictions aren't happening. Capitalism is adapting, not collapsing. Big revolutions seem unlikely. Wealth isn't just concentrating, it's spreading a bit. Class lines are blurring, not just hardening. So, he argued, the party should work within the system for gradual reforms, evolutionary socialism, rather than banking on a revolution that might never arrive.
The classic reform versus revolution debate. And Engels' later views seem relevant here.
Yes. The source mentions Engels later stating that the time of revolutions carried through by small conscious minorities at the head of unconscious masses is past. This is seen by the source as kind of anticipating and rejecting both earlier Blanquism and future Leninism, favoring instead the mass mobilization approach of German social democracy.
Which brings us squarely to Lenin's path, which the source portrays as a very deliberate choice of one revolutionary tradition over others.
The argument is that Lenin grabbed onto Marxism not as an open-ended critique like many intellectuals saw it, but as a finished blueprint, a practical scientific guide to seizing power and smashing the old order, which seemed more effective than the earlier Russian populists.
And he built this famous party of a new type.
Exactly. And in doing so, the source argues, he aligned himself with the strand of Marx that admired Blanquy's methods, the disciplined conspiratorial vanguard, rather than the later Marx Engels, who seemed to accept the mass party approach of the German SPD. This difference was right at the heart of the Bolshevik-Menshevik split, wasn't it? Lenin wanting professional conspirators, Martov wanting a broader party.
So Lenin's whole approach prioritized conspiracy, the tight-knit vanguard, believing you needed both propaganda and targeted agitation to forge a party that was essentially a weapon to take power.
Yes, a highly disciplined tool. And the source makes a grim link here to someone like Felix Dzerzhinsky, the incorruptible who built the Cheka, the Soviet secret police. The source calls it a fatal blending of police power and economic control,
Leading, tragically, to the destruction of the very Russian intelligentsia that had sparked so much revolutionary thought.
The source implies that the ruthless instrument Dzerzhinsky created to enforce a rigid revolutionary doctrine was ultimately turned against those who valued complexity, questioning, open debate, the hallmarks of the intelligentsia, a movement born from intellectual ferment consuming its own creators. A real tragedy described in the source.
These debates, reform revolution, vanguard mass party, blueprint critique, they're just fundamental, aren't they? Why did certain approaches win out in different places, according to the source?
Context seems key. The source strongly suggests that in Tsarist Russia, with its intense repression, Lenin's conspiratorial, centralized model felt necessary for survival and action. It offered a sense of certainty, an actionable plan in a chaotic, dangerous environment where the more open German model simply wasn't feasible. The appeal of a strategy really depended on the specific roadblocks and opportunities revolutionaries faced.
Okay, let's shift again this time to the energy coming directly from the working class early movements, syndicalism, and that powerful idea of the general strike.
The source touches on early U.S. movements, like the Molly Maguires and the Fenians, interesting because they were based in America but tied to Ireland, often using secret society methods. Also, big industrial unions like the Western Federation of Miners, with figures like Big Bill, Haywood leading major strikes like Cripple Creek.
And William Z. Foster trying to radicalize conservative unions from the inside, boring from within, and forming bigger, amalgamated unions.
It shows the variety of early worker organizing, especially in the U.S., from secretive ethnic groups to militant unions and strategic infiltration.
Then the source brings in Georgia Sorel and revolutionary syndicalism from Europe.
Sorel, influenced partly by Prathan's anti-state ideas, offered this powerful, almost philosophical justification for direct worker action. His big idea was the Great Proletarian General Strike, but not just as a tactic. He saw it as a redeeming myth for a modern post-religious world.
A redeeming myth, that's central to Sorel, isn't it? Not a falsehood, but a powerful, soul-stirring vision.
Exactly. He used the word myth deliberately. This general strike wasn't like an ordinary strike for wages or a political strike to achieve some reform. It was this total apocalyptic vision of workers completely transforming society through their own direct action, bypassing politics entirely. Workers had to reject middle-class values and keep this pure myth alive.
And he really emphasized class war.
Yeah, Sorel thought class war was the absolute core of Marxism, maybe even forgotten by Marx later. He saw it as heroic combat, the source of élan vital, life force, for the proletariat. He believed non-political groups like Bourses du Travail and syndicates, unions, could lead the revolution precisely because they weren't political, grounded in the workplace.
They could achieve total change through the general strike, but he saw a danger.
The big danger was the myth getting corrupted, turned into just a political strike, controlled by politicians using it for their own limited aims, maybe even joining the government. That would rob the myth of its power and the workers of their agency.
And Sorel's view on violence was distinctive, too.
He contrasted proletarian violence with bourgeois force, the state's power. He saw revolutionary violence as honest, spiritually invigorating, necessary to keep the class lines clear and prevent workers from being absorbed. It wasn't something to hide. It was part of the struggle.
Which connects powerfully to how workers' movements use strikes symbolically, ritually, like the Wobblies, the IWW in America.
Oh, the IWW were masters of symbolism. The source mentions that incredibly potent ritual, dyeing the flag with blood. That song lyric, "We wove the flag, we dyed the flag, but we won't scab under the flag." Chilling.
Creates fierce loyalty, right, beyond just a union card. And then there's that amazing event, the pageant of the Pattersonstjek in Madison Square Garden in 1913.
Just extraordinary. Art, labor, revolution, all colliding. Over 1,000 actual striking silk workers from Paterson, New Jersey, brought to New York. They worked with radical artists and were trained to perform, to reenact their own strike experiences.
Parades, a huge illuminated IWW sign, reenacting factory scenes, police brutality, mass meetings, culminating in reenacting the funeral of a slain striker.
The source quotes witnesses feeling the whole arena transformed into a temple for the consecration of revolution. It wasn't just a play. It was this collective act of memory, solidarity, rededication, using the actual people involved.
A temple, that's Sorel's myth brought to life, isn't it? Not just talking about it, but living it, performing it, making it this shared, almost sacred experience.
Exactly. It shows how movements can use symbolic action to stir deep emotions, build incredible solidarity, and create commitment that logic alone can't achieve. Perfectly illustrates Sorel's point about the power of non-rational mythic elements in struggle.
It really makes you think, how does a myth, separate from a program, work in movements? And what's the role of symbols and rituals in building that crucial solidarity and commitment?
Myths simplify things into powerful stories of struggle and hope. Symbols become instant emotional shorthand. Rituals like the pageant create shared experiences that forge deep bonds and make abstract ideas feel incredibly real and important. The source shows how movements, maybe intuitively, understood this power to generate the cohesion needed for long, hard struggles.
Okay, let's turn to something crucial, but often sidelined, which the source thankfully highlights: the role of women in these movements.
The source notes that in America, early on, women's rights were often linked with abolitionism and nonviolence. Oberlin College admitting black students and graduating women is mentioned.
And Frances Wright is called a rare phenomenon, a dedicated revolutionary woman in a relatively stable post-revolutionary society whose book Views of Society and Manners in America actually inspired European revolutionaries.
Yeah, an early, bold voice challenging norms, showing these ideas flowed both ways across the Atlantic.
But the source is blunt. Women participated, but their own liberation was often far away.
Absolutely. There was this stark gap. Rebel journals mocked women's demands. Male revolutionaries could be, as the source says, patronizingly indifferent to these Lady Vesuviuses. That quote from Delphine Gay, "Long live the provisional government," equals "long live the provisional ladies." Just nails that dismissive attitude.
Yet women were undeniably active in that literary populism of the 1840s, glorifying peasant art.
Women were apparently leaders in that, affirming the value of ordinary people's creativity. And in Russia, women's rights became a huge cause after serf emancipation, before the focus shifted fully to the proletariat. Chernyshevsky's novel, What Is to Be Done, gave this model of the new woman.
And Russia was surprisingly early in admitting women to universities, right? 1869-70.
Remarkably so, just months after England. And female students then played a massive role in radical agitation. In Zurich, a hub for Russian students abroad, women were apparently the majority of Russian students at one point. When the government ordered them back, the men came too in solidarity.
And they weren't just talking, they were in the thick of it. The movement to the people, the turn to terrorism, the source gives these incredible examples.
Vera Zasulich, shooting the St. Petersburg police chief, turning her trial into an indictment of the regime. Sofia Perovskaya, a leader in the group that assassinated Tsar Alexander II. Others like Maria Konoplyannikova and Matrina Prusyaznyk, noted for incredible bravery, Prusyaznyk's final speech even making waves in the U.S.
The source also mentions data. Female revolutionaries, especially SR terrorists, often came from privileged backgrounds, the educated intelligentsia.
Suggesting maybe education and a certain social standing paradoxically enabled their entry into these radical, demanding, often dangerous forms of activism.
And there was that women's group in Brussels linked to the First International.
Yeah, responding to Fourierist ideas. Interestingly, they argued for sex equality partly as a safeguard against authoritarian socialism. They pushed for practical things like daycare, seeing gender equality as essential for a truly democratic socialist future, pushing back against paternalism in the movement.
It's clear the fight for women's rights was deeply intertwined with the broader revolutionary goals, creating both energy and tension. What unique roles did women play, based on the source?
They were crucial agitators, organizers, theorists, cultural figures, and incredibly courageous fighters. They brought unique perspectives, often challenged the internal sexism of movements, claiming universal liberation, and demonstrated extraordinary bravery. They weren't just participants, they were driving forces, pushing both the revolution and their own specific struggles forward.
Finally, let's briefly touch on the engine that spread all these ideas, the press and communication.
Absolutely vital. Early revolutionary journals like L'Éclair du Peuple, Marx himself saw journalism as engaging philosophy as such against the world. His first signed piece was even about the invention of printing. He saw its power.
These papers in French, German, Italian, Russian, they connected scattered groups, spread ideas, built a shared identity.
And they spread symbols too. The source highlights the red flag appearing in papers like Harney's The Red Republican in England, which, fascinatingly, is where the Communist Manifesto first appeared in English, apparently calling communism a frightful hobgoblin and a translation error.
Huh, a frightful hobgoblin. But that image of the red flag spreading through print is powerful. How did communication tech shape these movements, according to the source?
Print allowed movements to scale up beyond face-to-face networks. Ideas, manifestos, calls to action traveled faster and wider, creating a sense of shared purpose across huge distances. Symbols like the red flag, spread through print, became instant emotional shorthand, rallying support in ways text alone couldn't.
Okay, what a journey through this material. We've covered so much. That shift in power from moral heroism to thermodynamic force.
The crucial, complex role of intellectuals and students, those crucibles of revolt like the Tchaikovsky Circle.
The pull of utopian visions, moving from escapist dreams to heroic calls to action, amplified by art and literature.
The hidden world of secret societies, the Illuminist triangles, the Carbonari, Buonarroti's phalanx, and its demand for purity.
And that bizarre symbiosis between revolutionaries and police in Russia, the Zubetov story. Just incredible.
Then the great ideological clashes. Proudhon versus Marx, the Social Democrats grappling with Bernstein's revisionism, Lenin forging his distinct path.
The raw energy of worker movements, Sorel's syndicalism, the potent myth of the general strike, vividly enacted in things like the Patterson pageant.
And the vital, often heroic, often challenging role of women throughout these struggles.
Finally, the fundamental power of the press and knitting it all together, spreading ideas and symbols like that red flag.
And the source makes it so clear. This wasn't one single story. It was this messy, complex, contradictory mix of ideas, people, methods, constant tension between conspiracy and mass action, reform and revolution, intellectual blueprints, and worker spontaneity.
Absolutely. Understanding these roots through the lens of the source really gives context for so much that came later, and even for today. That enduring power of ideas, organizations, symbols, that quest for a different world.
So, building on all that, the myths, the symbols, the mix of organization and force, here's a final thought for you, drawing from the source. We saw the myth of the general strike, the Patterson pageant, the Illuminati's triangle, the red flag. How do these things, the symbols, the stories, the very structures movements create, become as powerful, maybe even more powerful in driving change than the explicit political goals they state? Something to think about.
Definitely something to ponder. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into that fire in the mind.
Always more to uncover.
We'll see you next time on the Deep Dive.